The story of how the First World War began is often compressed into a single moment, a single gunshot, and a single name. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, struck down on a summer morning in Sarajevo. Yet the truth is far larger and far more complex than one man's death. It is a story of rising tensions, national pride, old empires clinging to fading glory, and a Europe drifting unknowingly toward catastrophe. And in many ways, the assassination was not an isolated incident, but the spark that fell onto a continent already soaked in suspicion and rivalries. In this documentary, we walk step by step through the world that produced the assassination, the people who carried it out, and the chain reaction that followed. It is a journey into an age of empires, secret societies, military plans, and political miscalculations that would ultimately plunge millions into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. To understand why Franz Ferdinand was in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, we must travel back to the late 19th century. Europe was dominated by powerful empires, each with ambitions and fears. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, vast but fragile, governed a mosaic of ethnic groups, languages, and histories. Among them were the South Slavs, including Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, and Serbs, many of whom dreamed of independence. The empire struggled to keep these regions loyal, even as nationalism spread like wildfire across the continent. Meanwhile, Serbia, a rising kingdom in the Balkans, envisioned itself as the leader of the Slavic peoples, a nation destined to unite them. This dream, known as Pan-Slavism, directly challenged Austria-Hungary's control over Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1878, Austria-Hungary was granted the right to administer these territories after the Congress of Berlin, though they remained officially under Ottoman rule. 30 years later, in 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, absorbing them into the empire. This decision outraged Serbia, shocked Russia, and inflamed nationalist groups throughout the Balkans. It was in this powder keg of resentment and ambition that Gavrilo Princip and the other young men who would one day become assassins grew up. By the early 20th century, the Balkans had already experienced waves of conflict. Serbia had expanded significantly during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. These victories emboldened Serbian nationalists and alarmed Austria-Hungary, which feared a stronger Serbia might encourage rebellion among its own Slavic populations. The government in Vienna began viewing Serbia not simply as a rival, but as an existential threat to imperial stability. Inside this tense relationship, secret societies emerged. Among them was the Black Hand, a clandestine nationalist organization formed by Serbian military officers who believed violence and sabotage were legitimate tools to weaken Austria-Hungary and unite the South Slavs. Gavrilo Princip, the man who would fire the fatal shot, was born in 1894 in a small village called Obiljic, in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. He grew up in poverty, the son of a peasant family, and like many young Slavs of his generation, he was shaped by the injustice of foreign rule. When he moved to Sarajevo as a teenager and later to Belgrade, he absorbed the ideas of revolutionary nationalism. He believed deeply that Bosnia should not remain under Austro-Hungarian control. Princip and his friends were members of a youth movement called Young Bosnia, a group that shared similar goals with the Black Hand, though they were not identical organizations. Young Bosnia focused on liberation and unification through nationalist ideals, while the Black Hand operated more like a covert paramilitary network focused on direct action. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand announced he would visit Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, nationalist circles saw an opportunity. The date carried powerful symbolism. It was Vidovdan, or St. Vitus Day, one of the most sacred days in Serbian history. It marked the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a foundational moment in Serbian identity. For many nationalists, Franz Ferdinand's presence in Bosnia on that day was not merely a political visit. They saw it as an insult. To them, he was a representative of a foreign empire occupying Slavic land, arriving on a sacred national holiday. The symbolism was too compelling to ignore. But who exactly was Franz Ferdinand, and why did he matter so much? Born in 1863, he was next in line to inherit the Austro-Hungarian throne after Emperor Franz Joseph. Franz Ferdinand was known for his strong personality, his firm views, and his belief that the empire needed reform. Unlike many conservatives in Vienna, he believed that the empire must grant greater autonomy to its Slavic subjects. He imagined a future federation inside the empire, with more equality among national groups. Ironically, this vision threatened Serbia even more. A reformed, federalized empire with content Slavic provinces would weaken the dream of a united independent South Slavic state. Nationalists feared that if Franz Ferdinand became emperor, Slavic grievances might be eased, and Serbia's influence would diminish. To them, removing him seemed like a direct path to keeping the dream of unification alive. As the Archduke prepared for his visit, the conspirators in Belgrade began planning. The Black Hand supplied weapons, cyanide pills, and training. 6 young men were selected to carry out the mission. Their names included Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko Kabranovic, Trifko Grabez, Veso Kubrilovic, Jetko Popovic, and Muhamed Mehmed Basic. All were young, most in their teens or early 20s, and all were driven by nationalist passion. They crossed the border secretly and made their way towards Sarajevo, each assigned a position along the Archduke's motorcade route. They carried grenades, revolvers, and bombs, prepared to strike at the first opportunity. Meanwhile, Sarajevo prepared for the Archduke's arrival. The city was decorated, officials rehearsed the ceremony, and security arrangements were made. But these arrangements were terribly flawed. The security presence was light, the route was publicly announced in advance, and the authorities underestimated the threat entirely. The governor of Bosnia, Oskar Podijorek, believed that no one would dare attack such a high-profile figure. He dismissed warnings, confident that everything would go according to plan. On the morning of June 28, the Archduke and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo by train. They stepped onto the platform greeted by officials and military officers. Sophie, who was deeply devoted to her husband, had insisted on accompanying him on this trip despite security concerns. The couple entered an open-topped car, an elegant but vulnerable vehicle. The motorcade began its journey through the streets, heading toward the city hall. Crowds lined the sidewalks, some excited to see the Archduke, others indifferent, and a few quietly hostile. Unbeknownst to Franz Ferdinand, he was passing by assassins already in position. The first man, Mehmed Basic, reportedly lost his nerve and failed to act. The second conspirator, Kabranovic, did not hesitate. As the Archduke's car approached, Kabranovic hurled a bomb at it. The Archduke saw it coming and raised his arm in reaction. The bomb bounced off the folded roof of the car and exploded beneath the next vehicle in the procession. The blast injured several people, including officers and bystanders, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were unharmed. Kabranovic swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into the river to escape. But the cyanide was old and ineffective, and the river was shallow. He was quickly pulled out and arrested. The assassination attempt clearly revealed that danger was real, yet the day continued with surprising calm. The Archduke proceeded to the city hall, where he criticized officials for the inadequate security but agreed to continue with the day's schedule. After the formal reception, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital. This decision altered the motorcade's route slightly, a change that would prove fatal. The drivers were not properly informed, and when they reached the Latin Bridge, they turned into a wrong street. The cars slowed as officials realized the mistake. At that exact moment, Gavrilo Princip, who had earlier failed to act during the first attack, happened to be standing outside a delicatessen. He had assumed the mission was over and was contemplating what to do next. Suddenly, the Archduke's car stopped just a few feet away from him. This extraordinary coincidence has become one of the most debated moments in history. Princip seized his chance. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The car lurched backward, and chaos erupted. Sophie collapsed against her husband. Franz Ferdinand, bleeding heavily, begged her to stay alive. But within minutes, both were dead. It was shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife had been assassinated on the streets of Sarajevo by a 19-year-old nationalist. The shockwaves spread instantly across Europe. But at first, no one imagined a global war would follow. Assassinations had happened before without triggering continent-wide conflict. However, this event occurred in a world already on edge, governed by powerful alliances and military plans that left little room for compromise. The next steps taken by Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain would determine the fate of millions. And as we will see in the next part, the assassination did not cause the First World War on its own. It unleashed a chain reaction fueled by fear, pride, obligations, and fatal miscalculations, pushing Europe step by step toward disaster. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand sent a shiver through the Austro-Hungarian leadership, but in the hours immediately after the attack, the empire remained uncertain about how to respond. News traveled from Sarajevo to Vienna, where Emperor Franz Joseph received it with weary resignation. He was 83 years old, having ruled for more than 6 decades, and had outlived his wife, his son, and countless political crises. Although the Archduke was his heir, relations between the two men had never been warm. Still, the death of Franz Ferdinand was a blow to the monarchy, not only personally but symbolically. It revealed vulnerabilities within the empire that could no longer be ignored. The initial reaction of the Austrian government was confusion. They knew the assassins were young Bosnian Serbs. They knew the weapons had been smuggled in from Serbia. And some officials suspected that elements of the Serbian military or government might have quietly supported the operation. But Austria-Hungary faced a dilemma. If they responded too harshly, they risked provoking Russia, Serbia's protector. If they responded too softly, they risked appearing weak, encouraging further nationalist agitation within their borders. The leadership in Vienna wanted to punish Serbia, but they feared the consequences. The man who most strongly pushed for a firm response was Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, one of the empire's most influential military leaders. He had long believed that Austria-Hungary must confront Serbia decisively before the smaller kingdom grew stronger. For years he had advocated for preventive war, arguing that Serbia was a cancer threatening the stability of the empire. The foreign minister, Count Leopold Berchtold, also leaned toward a severe response. He saw the assassination as an opportunity to reassert imperial authority. But Austria-Hungary could not act alone. If war with Serbia drew Russia into the conflict, Austria would need its ally Germany to stand behind it. Germany's response became the decisive factor. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his military and political advisors received the news with alarm but also with a sense of opportunity. Germany was bound to Austria-Hungary through the dual alliance, promising mutual support. In the Kaiser's mind, this alliance was essential to maintaining Germany's status as a great power in Europe. Yet Germany also feared Russia's rapid military expansion. Russian leaders were modernizing their army and improving their railroads. Many in Berlin believed that within a few years Russia would be far too strong to confront. From this perspective, if war was inevitable, better it come sooner rather than later. On July 5, 1914, Austria-Hungary sent a formal request to Germany, asking whether it would support punitive action against Serbia. The Kaiser and his government responded with what later became known as the blank check. Germany promised full support, even if Austria-Hungary's actions led to war with Russia. This unconditional backing emboldened Vienna. It signaled that the German Empire was prepared to risk a broader conflict. With this assurance, Austria-Hungary began drafting an ultimatum to Serbia. Meanwhile, Serbia was not unaware of the danger it faced. Serbian intelligence had some knowledge of the assassination plot, although its exact role remains debated by historians. The Serbian government officially condemned the attack and feared that Austria-Hungary would seize the moment to crush Serbia's growing influence. Serbia's prime minister at the time, Nikola Pašić, was a cautious man who understood that provoking Austria-Hungary could mean national disaster. But Serbia was a young and increasingly confident nation, buoyed by its victories in the Balkan Wars, and public opinion favored defiance over submission. As Austria-Hungary prepared its ultimatum, tensions across Europe rose. Yet ordinary people, for the most part, carried on with daily life. Newspaper headlines grew more intense, but few imagined that a major war was around the corner. Europe had enjoyed decades of relative peace, and many believed diplomacy would prevail as it often had during earlier crises. Even some leaders thought that, as in the past, the continent would back away from the brink. The situation changed dramatically on July 23, 1914, when Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. It was intentionally severe, crafted so Serbia would be unable to accept it fully. Among its 10 demands were requirements that Serbia suppress anti-Austrian groups, dismiss certain military officers, accept Austro-Hungarian officials inside Serbia to help conduct investigations, and publicly condemn nationalist propaganda. This last demand, insisting on Austro-Hungarian involvement within Serbia's internal affairs, struck at the heart of Serbian sovereignty. Serbia was given 48 hours to respond. Panic spread through Belgrade as the government debated its options. Russia, the protector of Slavic nations, signaled that it would not abandon Serbia. But the Russian military was not fully prepared for war. France, Russia's ally, was supportive but geographically distant. Serbia faced a terrible choice: accept humiliating terms and lose national dignity, or reject the demands and risk annihilation. Serbia's final reply on July 25 was a masterpiece of diplomatic language. Serbia accepted most of the demands but rejected the key one, allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to operate on Serbian soil. It asked that any disputes be resolved by the International Tribunal at The Hague. This response was peaceful, conciliatory, and crafted to appear reasonable to the world. Yet Austria-Hungary viewed the rejection of even one demand as unacceptable. Vienna now had what it considered a diplomatic justification for war. Austria-Hungary severed relations with Serbia. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war. Artillery began bombarding Belgrade that night. But the conflict was no longer a local struggle. It was about to pull Europe into a chain of mobilizations and counter-mobilizations that would be impossible to stop. Russia's decision to support Serbia was the next critical step. Tsar Nicholas II faced enormous pressure. Russia could not allow Austria-Hungary to destroy Serbia, for doing so would severely weaken Russian influence in the Balkans. Yet the Tsar was personally hesitant. He knew that Russia was not fully ready for war. Nevertheless, on July 30, under pressure from his generals and government ministers, Nicholas authorized full mobilization of the Russian army. Mobilization meant preparing millions of soldiers, activating supply lines, and placing the entire nation on a war footing. To Germany, Russian mobilization was viewed as an act of aggression. The German military leadership believed that if Russia mobilized, Germany must respond immediately. Their entire war strategy centered on the Schlieffen Plan, a military plan developed years earlier. It assumed that Germany would face a two-front war against France and Russia. The plan required Germany to strike France first with overwhelming force by marching through neutral Belgium, defeating France quickly before turning east to fight Russia. This strategy was rigid. It allowed no room for delays. Once Russia mobilized, the German plan demanded action. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. That same day, France began mobilizing its forces. Germany issued ultimatums to Belgium and France, demanding free passage for German troops. When these demands were rejected, Germany declared war on France on August 3 and invaded Belgium on August 4. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany that evening. The First World War had begun. What had started as a small local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had now become a continental war involving all major European powers. The alliances, military plans, national rivalries, and political decisions of the previous decades converged in a catastrophe that few had foreseen and none could stop. Europe's leaders had believed that their actions would secure national honor and maintain strategic advantage. Instead, they had awakened a storm that would destroy empires. As soldiers marched, civilians gathered in towns and cities across Europe, watching trainloads of young men depart with cheers, flags, and optimism. Many believed the war would be short. They thought it would be over by Christmas. Crowds celebrated, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of a conflict that would last for long years and claim the lives of millions. The world of 1914 was about to disappear forever. But the opening of the Great War is only part of this story. To truly understand how the assassination in Sarajevo turned into a global conflict, we must look more closely at the deeper forces that drove Europe toward war. These forces were years, even decades, in the making. They shaped the world in which the assassination occurred, and they help explain why a single act of violence triggered an unprecedented catastrophe. The next section explores these underlying tensions and how they converged in 1914 to ignite the First World War. To understand why the assassination of Franz Ferdinand became the spark that set Europe ablaze, we must step back and examine the deeper tensions that had been building for decades. The Great War did not arise from a single grievance or rivalry, but from an intricate web of ambitions, fears, alliances, and misunderstandings. By the time the Archduke's car turned onto that wrong street in Sarajevo, Europe had already created the conditions for a disaster. The assassination was simply the match dropped into an ever-growing pile of tinder. One of the most important forces at work in the years leading up to the war was nationalism. Throughout the 19th century, national identity had grown stronger across Europe. People increasingly saw themselves not only as subjects of empires but as members of nations united by language, culture, and shared history. In Western Europe, nationalism had helped create unified nations like Germany and Italy. But in Central and Eastern Europe, where empires ruled over diverse populations, nationalism became volatile. The Austro-Hungarian Empire contained a patchwork of ethnic groups, many of whom desired independence or greater autonomy. Serbs, Croats, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Romanians, Ukrainians, and others all lived under imperial authority, each with their own aspirations. Among these groups, the South Slavs were particularly restless. Serbia's growing influence in the Balkans encouraged these ambitions. Many Slavs within Austria-Hungary looked to Serbia as a symbol of independence. This created enormous tension within the empire. Vienna feared that if nationalist dreams were allowed to spread unchecked, the entire empire might crumble. Austria-Hungary's leaders believed they had to contain Serbian influence or risk losing their multinational state altogether. Nationalism also flourished inside Serbia itself. After victories in the Balkan Wars, Serbia's confidence grew. For Serbian nationalists, the unification of all South Slavs into a single state was not just a political plan but a historic destiny. Groups like the Black Hands saw themselves as patriots fighting for a noble cause. But their vision was fundamentally incompatible with Austria-Hungary's efforts to maintain control over Bosnia. This collision of national dreams created an atmosphere in which violence became thinkable and, to some, even necessary. Another major factor driving Europe toward war was imperialism. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European powers competed fiercely for colonies, resources, and influence around the globe. This rivalry was especially intense between Britain, France, and Germany. Germany, unified only in 1871, entered the imperial competition later than its rivals. It sought its own place under the sun, as Kaiser Wilhelm famously put it. But as Germany expanded its navy and asserted itself overseas, Britain grew increasingly suspicious. British leaders worried that Germany's ambitions threatened the balance of power that Britain had long dominated. Tensions grew as the two nations built larger and more advanced fleets, each fearing that the other might one day control the seas. Militarism also played a significant role. In the years before the war, European nations invested heavily in their armies and navies. Military leaders gained growing influence over national policy. Germany developed the Schlieffen Plan, France prepared its own Plan 17, and Russia worked to modernize its vast but cumbersome military. These plans were rigid and demanded fast, decisive action in the event of a crisis. Once mobilization began, it was extremely difficult to stop. Diplomacy was constrained by the reality that generals expected war to unfold with speed and precision. Many political leaders believed mobilization was essential to avoid being caught unprepared. As a result, military timetables often dictated political decisions. Alliances further complicated the situation. Europe's major powers were divided into two rival blocs. On one side stood the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's loyalty to this alliance would prove uncertain. On the other side stood the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances were designed to provide security, but they also created obligations that could drag nations into conflicts not their own. A local dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia quickly became a concern for Russia, which then pulled in Germany, which in turn made France and Britain take notice. The alliances did not make war inevitable, but they ensured that once war began, it would not remain confined. Economic competition also played a role. Industrial growth transformed Europe. Germany became a major industrial power, challenging British economic dominance. Countries competed for markets, raw materials, and strategic advantages. Many leaders believed that national strength depended on industrial production and military capacity. This economic rivalry fed into political tensions, reinforcing the sense that nations were competing in a zero-sum struggle for survival and prosperity. Deepening all these tensions was the widespread belief that war was not only possible but, in some circles, even inevitable. Many military and political leaders believed that a major war could cleanse national problems, unite populations, or settle disputes once and for all. This belief was not universal, but it influenced decision-making in subtle ways. Some leaders felt that delaying a conflict would only make it worse. Germany, for example, feared that Russia's rapid military expansion would soon make it unbeatable. Austria-Hungary feared that Serbian nationalism would grow stronger with each passing year. Even Russia feared losing influence in the Balkans if it failed to act. All these forces converged in the summer of 1914. When Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, each nation interpreted the event through its own fears and ambitions. Austria-Hungary saw a direct threat to its existence. Serbia saw an attempt to crush its national aspirations. Russia saw an opportunity to defend Slavic honor and maintain influence. Germany saw the moment as a test of its alliance and a chance to secure its strategic position before Russia grew too strong. France saw an opportunity to support Russia and strengthen its own security. Britain, torn between obligations and reluctance, watched as events spiraled out of control. The pressures of nationalism, militarism, imperial rivalry, and alliances formed a structure that could no longer absorb shocks. The assassination struck at its weakest point. The crisis that followed revealed just how fragile the peace had become. Political leaders misjudged one another's intentions, believing they could issue threats without risking full-scale war. But each step taken by one nation forced reactions from others. Diplomacy failed not only because leaders lacked creativity, but because their decisions were locked inside a system that rewarded firmness and punished hesitation. As Austria-Hungary moved toward war with Serbia, Germany urged decisive action. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany mobilized in response to Russia. France stood by its alliance with Russia. Britain faced the choice of allowing German domination of Western Europe or entering the conflict. None of these decisions were made lightly, but each was shaped by years of tension and mistrust. The assassination did not create these problems. It exposed them. This is why historians often say that the assassination was the spark, not the cause, of the First World War. The true causes developed over decades. But the spark was powerful enough to ignite the entire system. The days following the assassination revealed how easily miscalculations could escalate. Austria-Hungary believed that Serbia would either capitulate or be quickly defeated. Germany believed that Russia would hesitate to mobilize. France believed it could not abandon Russia without weakening itself. Britain believed that German aggression against Belgium was unacceptable. Each nation believed that its own honor, security, or survival was at stake. As the crisis unfolded, time played a dangerous role. Mobilization schedules left little room for negotiation. Trains had to move. Soldiers had to gather. Supplies had to be delivered. Once these processes began, stopping them became nearly impossible. Military plans took precedence over diplomacy. The rigid nature of these plans contributed significantly to the escalation. Germany's Schlieffen Plan required immediate offensive action against France. It did not allow for partial mobilization or diplomatic delay. This inflexibility turned a political crisis into a military confrontation of unimaginable scale. Meanwhile, the young men who would soon be fighting in the trenches had no idea what awaited them. Across Europe, life continued with the routines of summer. In cafes, parks, and marketplaces, people discussed the crisis but did not expect a world-changing war. Many believed that the powers would find a compromise as they had during previous conflicts. Few imagined the scale of destruction that industrialized warfare would bring. They did not foresee the trenches, the gas attacks, the machine gun fire, or the years of stalemate that would define the Great War. As we continue, the next part of the documentary will follow the rapid escalation from a regional crisis into a full-scale continental war. We will trace the diplomatic failures, the final decisions made in each capital, and the first movements of armies across Europe as the Great War began to unfold. In the final days of July 1914, Europe moved toward war with a momentum that seemed almost unstoppable. Each nation watched the others with suspicion, interpreting every action as a potential threat. Diplomatic messages flew between capitals, but the tone hardened with every hour. No one wanted to be seen as weak, yet few truly understood the catastrophic consequences of the decisions they were making. What had begun as a regional crisis between Austria-Hungary and Serbia now grew into a continental confrontation. Austria-Hungary had already declared war on Serbia, and artillery shells had begun to fall on Belgrade. This bombardment intensified the crisis. Russia, bound by cultural ties and strategic interests, could not ignore Serbia's plight. Tsar Nicholas II struggled with the decision, torn between avoiding a disastrous war and preventing the humiliation of abandoning a fellow Slavic nation. His generals insisted that Russia must act quickly or risk losing influence in the Balkans permanently. After days of hesitation, Nicholas authorized partial mobilization on July 29. But the situation soon grew more complicated. German military leaders believed that Russian mobilization, even if partial, posed an immediate danger. Their war plan required swift movement and decisive action. To delay was to invite disaster. Germany therefore issued warnings to Russia, insisting that it stop all mobilization. Russia, however, refused. The Russian leadership felt that preparations were necessary to protect against Austria-Hungary's advancing forces. On July 30, Russia took the irreversible step of ordering full mobilization. This placed millions of soldiers and vast supplies in motion. To Germany, this action represented a clear signal that war was imminent. Kaiser Wilhelm and his government believed that if they did not act quickly, they would face war on two fronts under disadvantageous conditions. Germany therefore began its own mobilization process. On August 1, it declared war on Russia. France now found itself drawn into the conflict. Bound by alliance to Russia, and concerned by Germany's aggressive posture, France prepared for war. The French leadership had long feared German power, especially after the loss of Alsace-Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. This territorial loss remained a deep wound in French national memory. By supporting Russia, France hoped to strengthen its position and recover lost prestige. On August 3, Germany declared war on France and began preparing to invade through Belgium. Belgium was a neutral nation whose independence had been guaranteed by major European powers, including Britain. But Germany's war plan demanded rapid movement through Belgian territory to strike France from the north. German generals argued that the plan would fail without this maneuver. Diplomatic constraints were dismissed in favor of military necessity. Germany delivered an ultimatum to Belgium, demanding free passage for its troops. Belgium staunchly refused, defending its sovereignty. This refusal delayed German forces slightly but more importantly drew Britain into the crisis. Britain had long been hesitant to commit itself to a land war in Europe. The British government valued peace but feared the consequences of unchecked German expansion. When Germany violated Belgian neutrality by crossing the border on August 4, Britain declared war on Germany. The British people, much like those in the rest of Europe, did not yet understand the magnitude of the conflict they were entering, but they rallied behind their government's decision. The dominoes had now fallen. Austria-Hungary was at war with Serbia. Russia was at war with Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany was at war with Russia, France, and Belgium. Britain was at war with Germany. Italy, though officially part of the Triple Alliance, remained neutral for the moment, arguing that the alliance was defensive in nature and that Germany and Austria-Hungary had acted offensively. Within days, Europe's great powers had become entangled in a war that none had originally sought in this form. As armies mobilized, the scale of the conflict became apparent. Millions of soldiers left their homes, many expecting a short war. In Germany, patriotic crowds sang in the streets. In France, men marched to the stations beneath banners proclaiming victory. In Russia, peasants and workers were swept into mobilization. And in Austria-Hungary, people rallied in a rare moment of unity for a cause that quickly became far larger than the empire itself. It was a collective rush to conflict unmatched in European history. The opening weeks of the war were marked by rapid movement. Germany advanced through Belgium with overwhelming force, encountering unexpected resistance from Belgian troops. The defense of Liège delayed the German timetable but did not stop the invasion. The German army pushed deeper into Belgium and then into France, believing that speed was essential to the success of their plan. Steam-powered trains, telegraphs, and modern logistics allowed for unprecedented coordination and movement. France, meanwhile, launched its own offensive, Plan 17, aimed at recapturing Alsace-Lorraine. French soldiers, dressed in bright uniforms and filled with patriotic fervor, fought bravely but suffered heavy losses. The German military, equipped with more modern tactics and superior artillery, pushed the French forces back. By the end of August, German troops were approaching Paris. The situation seemed dire for the French Republic. Yet Germany's plan began to falter. The rapid advance stretched supply lines and exhausted troops. Communications became strained. The unexpected resolve of Belgian forces, combined with fierce French resistance, slowed the German momentum. Moreover, Britain had begun landing troops on the continent. Although small in number at first, the British Expeditionary Force was highly trained and played a crucial role in stabilizing the front. The Germans underestimated the fighting capability of the British soldiers, who held firm against multiple assaults. The turning point of the early war came in September 1914 at the First Battle of the Marne. French and British forces launched a counterattack that halted the German advance. For the first time, the momentum shifted away from Germany. Unable to achieve a quick victory, the German army retreated slightly and began digging defensive trenches. The French and British responded by digging their own. What had started as a war of movement now transformed into a war of attrition. The trench lines soon stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, creating a fortified barrier thousands of kilometers long. Soldiers lived in mud-filled trenches, enduring constant shelling, disease, and the ever-present danger of enemy fire. Generals on both sides struggled to adapt to the realities of modern industrial warfare. Old tactics of frontal assault clashed with new technologies like machine guns, barbed wire, and heavy artillery, resulting in staggering casualties for limited territorial gains. While the Western Front became locked in stalemate, other theaters of war opened. Austria-Hungary struggled against Serbia, facing early defeats despite its larger size. Russia launched massive offensives against Germany and Austria-Hungary, achieving some initial successes but suffering catastrophic losses at battles such as Tannenberg. Each front contributed to the growing scale of the conflict, drawing more nations into the fighting. As the war expanded, governments introduced measures that reshaped society. Conscription, rationing, and censorship became commonplace. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, replacing men who had gone to the front. Factories retooled to produce weapons, ammunition, and supplies for the war effort. Entire economies became engines of war. The world was witnessing a conflict unlike any before it. Modern technology, industrial power, and mass mobilization transformed warfare into a devastating machine. And yet, the roots of this destruction traced back to that June morning in Sarajevo, when a 19-year-old nationalist fired 2 shots that tore through far more than the lives of Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Those shots pierced the fragile structure of European diplomacy, exposing vulnerabilities that had long been ignored. In the next part of this documentary, we will return to Sarajevo and the immediate aftermath of the assassination, examining how local events set the stage for a global crisis. We will follow the investigation, the trials of the conspirators, and the political shockwaves that spread through the Balkans before engulfing the world. After the shots were fired in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, the city descended into confusion. Crowds scattered, police officers rushed toward the scene, and rumors spread rapidly through the streets. The Archduke's car sped toward the governor's residence, but it was quickly clear that both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were dying. Within minutes, they were pronounced dead. Their bodies were placed under guard, and officials began notifying Vienna of the tragedy that would soon shake the world. Sarajevo's authorities moved swiftly to arrest suspects. Nedeljko Kabranovic, who had thrown the bomb earlier that morning, had already been captured after his failed attempt to commit suicide. Gavrilo Princip was seized moments after firing his shots. He did not resist. When confronted by police, he declared that he was a nationalist fighting for the freedom of his people. Several other conspirators were captured in the following days, though a few managed to escape across the border. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was filled with fear and uncertainty. Sarajevo was placed under strict security. Homes were searched, arrests increased, and officials sought to uncover any network that might be behind the attack. Crowds gathered in shock, some grieving, others fearful of what might come next. In the tense ethnic environment of Bosnia, the assassination sparked outbreaks of violence against Serbs living in the city. Angry mobs vandalized shops and homes, blaming the entire Serbian community for the actions of a handful of nationalists. Austrian authorities struggled to contain the unrest. The bodies of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were transported back to Vienna with solemn ceremony. Court officials, military leaders, and members of the imperial family gathered to pay their respects. Despite the strained relationship between Emperor Franz Joseph and his nephew, the emperor understood the gravity of the moment. The assassination of the heir to the throne was an attack not only on a man but on the imperial institution itself. The empire mourned, yet the atmosphere remained subdued. Franz Ferdinand had never been widely popular among the ruling elite, largely because of his marriage to Sophie, who was of lesser nobility. But even among his critics, there was recognition that something unprecedented and deeply troubling had occurred. As the funeral proceeded, Vienna's leaders began assessing the political implications. They knew that the assassins were young Bosnian Serbs, and evidence quickly showed that the weapons used in the attack had been smuggled from across the border. Documents recovered from the conspirators suggested connections to nationalist circles in Serbia. But whether the Serbian government itself had been involved was less clear. Some in Vienna believed that rogue officers within Serbia's military intelligence had supported the plot. Others suspected a broader conspiracy. But there was no definitive proof that Serbia's government had ordered the assassination. Despite this uncertainty, Austria-Hungary's leaders saw an opportunity. For years, they had viewed Serbia as a growing threat. Serbia's victories in the Balkan Wars had emboldened its nationalist ambitions, and its population had nearly doubled. The empire feared that unrest among its own Slavic populations would worsen if Serbia continued gaining influence. The assassination provided a justification for decisive action, even if responsibility was not entirely clear. Austria-Hungary launched an investigation into the plot, interrogating the captured suspects. Princip, Kabranovic, and the others were questioned for weeks. They revealed the basics of their plan, including how they had obtained their weapons and crossed the border. They admitted to being inspired by nationalist ideals, and some spoke openly of their hatred for Austro-Hungarian rule. However, they were careful when discussing the Black Hand and its leaders in Serbia. They refused to implicate certain individuals, and some details remained vague. Nevertheless, Vienna concluded that Serbia bore at least indirect responsibility. The trial of the conspirators took place in October 1914, after war had already begun. Because Princip was 19 at the time of the assassination, he was too young to receive the death penalty under Austro-Hungarian law. Instead, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed for his age. Kabranovic and others received similar sentences. The harsh conditions of their imprisonment would prove fatal. Princip died of tuberculosis in 1918, shortly before the end of the war he helped ignite. While Sarajevo dealt with arrests and trials, the political crisis spread across the Balkans. Serbia publicly expressed condolences but privately feared what Austria-Hungary might do next. Serbian officials denied any involvement in the assassination, though they understood that Vienna would likely use the incident to justify aggressive action. Many Serbian leaders suspected that Austria-Hungary intended to crush Serbia's independence. The Balkan region had long been unstable. The decline of the Ottoman Empire had opened power vacuums and fueled territorial disputes. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had altered borders dramatically. These conflicts had left deep wounds and intensified rivalries. Serbia considered itself a rising power, but Austria-Hungary feared that Serbia's success would inspire separatism within the empire. The assassination thus became a symbol of the struggle over the future of the Balkans. Across Europe, leaders reacted with varying degrees of shock and concern. In Russia, the assassination strengthened the belief that Austria-Hungary sought to dominate the Balkans. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations and believed it must support Serbia. In Germany, the assassination was viewed as a dangerous but potentially manageable crisis. The Kaiser initially expressed sympathy for Franz Ferdinand and outrage at the attack. But within days, Germany's leadership began considering how the crisis might unfold and how it could potentially benefit German strategic interests. France watched the situation closely. Bound by alliance to Russia, France understood that it might be drawn into any conflict involving Russia and Germany. French leaders hoped for a peaceful resolution but prepared for the worst. Britain, meanwhile, observed events with caution. Its primary concerns involved the balance of power in Europe and maintaining access to trade routes. Many British leaders hoped that the crisis would remain regional and not disrupt the broader peace. Yet beneath the diplomatic language and cautious statements, Europe was quietly aligning itself for conflict. Austria-Hungary's leaders believed they must act decisively or risk losing credibility. Serbia felt its survival was at stake. Russia refused to abandon Serbia. Germany pledged to support Austria-Hungary, believing that hesitation would weaken the alliance and diminish German influence. France stood behind Russia. Britain watched warily, knowing that German aggression toward France or Belgium could force it to intervene. Europe's great powers were locked in a dangerous pattern, each acting in ways they believed were defensive, yet each contributing to the growing likelihood of war. As July 1914 progressed, Austria-Hungary prepared its ultimatum to Serbia, one of the most consequential diplomatic documents in modern history. Crafted with the intention of being rejected, it set in motion the final steps that would lead to war. The ultimatum demanded that Serbia suppress anti-Austrian groups and propaganda, dismiss certain military officers, and allow Austro-Hungarian officials to operate within Serbia to oversee the investigation. No sovereign nation could accept such intrusive terms without losing control over its own internal affairs. Serbia's response was measured and conciliatory, accepting most demands but rejecting those that violated its sovereignty. Some European leaders saw Serbia's reply as reasonable. Even Kaiser Wilhelm briefly believed the crisis might be resolved peacefully. But Vienna, backed by Berlin, had already committed to war. Diplomacy failed not because compromise was impossible, but because key leaders believed that compromise would weaken their nations. The declaration of war at the end of July transformed the assassination from a regional tragedy into the opening chapter of a global calamity. Artillery shook the banks of the Danube, and soldiers marched toward the front. Mobilization orders spread across Europe. The crisis had escaped the control of diplomats and statesmen. A conflict fueled by nationalism, alliances, imperial ambitions, and miscalculations had begun. In the next part of the documentary, we will explore how the assassination affected ordinary people across Europe and how early public reactions shaped the unfolding war. We will examine how newspapers, governments, and citizens interpreted the Sarajevo attack, and how public sentiment played a crucial role in the march toward conflict. Across Europe, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the crisis that followed stirred powerful emotions among ordinary citizens. Newspapers filled their front pages with dramatic headlines. Editorials speculated about responsibility and predicted various outcomes. People gathered in cafes, marketplaces, and railway stations to discuss the future, often with limited understanding of the deeper forces at work. Public reactions influenced political decisions more than many realized, for governments feared losing popular support if they appeared weak or indecisive. In Austria-Hungary, the news of the assassination sparked both grief and fury. Many citizens, especially among the empire's German and Hungarian populations, viewed the attack as a direct assault on their nation's dignity. Franz Ferdinand had not been universally loved, but the manner of his death provoked a sense of outrage. Demonstrations erupted in cities such as Vienna, Budapest, and Prague. Crowds demanded punishment for Serbia, whom they blamed for inciting the act. Newspapers called for firm action, urging the government to defend the empire's honor. However, the empire was ethnically diverse, and not all groups shared the same sentiment. Among the Slavic populations, particularly in Bosnia, Croatia, and parts of Hungary, responses were more divided. Some felt sympathy for the Archduke and his wife, but others privately viewed the assassination as a sign of resistance against an imperial authority they resented. The Austro-Hungarian leadership understood this tension. They feared that failing to respond forcefully would encourage further separatist movements. Public pressure aligned with political strategy, contributing to the decision to issue the harsh ultimatum to Serbia. In Serbia, the reaction was a mixture of fear, denial, and defensiveness. Serbian leaders knew the assassination could bring disaster to their small nation. While some Serbian newspapers praised the young assassins as heroes fighting for national liberation, the government condemned the attack officially. Behind closed doors, Serbia's leaders recognized the gravity of the situation. They worried that Austria-Hungary would exploit the assassination as a pretext for war. Serbian citizens, too, feared an invasion, remembering all too well the destruction and losses from the recent Balkan wars. When Austria-Hungary's ultimatum arrived, Serbian people reacted with shock. Many believed the demands were impossible to meet. Public gatherings formed outside government buildings, where people anxiously awaited news. As the crisis deepened, Serbian nationalism intensified. Patriotic volunteers began preparing for war even before hostilities officially began. Despite the danger, many Serbs felt that their nation's honor was at stake and that resisting Austria-Hungary was a matter of survival. In Russia, the assassination drew immediate attention. Russian newspapers portrayed the event as an attack on all Slavic peoples. Serbia was widely viewed as Russia's little brother, deserving protection against Austrian aggression. Public sentiment strongly favored supporting Serbia, and political leaders took note. If the Tsar had attempted to abandon Serbia, he would have faced fierce backlash from both the public and influential nationalist groups. Many Russians believed that Austria-Hungary sought to dominate the Balkans at Russia's expense, and that failing to intervene would weaken Russia's standing as a great power. The decision to mobilize Russia's army was not made lightly, but public enthusiasm played a role. Russian crowds filled the streets of major cities, waving flags and calling for action. They believed that defending Serbia was a moral obligation. This sentiment helped push the Tsar and his advisors toward full mobilization, despite their fears about the consequences. In Germany, public opinion was shaped by a mix of loyalty to Austria-Hungary, suspicion of Russia, and national pride. German newspapers initially expressed sympathy for the Archduke's death and condemned the assassins. Many citizens believed that Serbia was responsible for fostering terrorism. When Russia began mobilizing, German public opinion hardened. Crowds supported the Kaiser's decision to prepare for war, believing Russia's actions left Germany no choice. Nationalist demonstrations erupted in Berlin and other major cities, with people cheering the prospect of defending the fatherland against what they saw as Slavic aggression. Germany's political leaders understood that public support would be essential for the war effort. They presented the conflict as a defensive struggle forced upon Germany by hostile neighbors. This interpretation resonated with the public, who remembered earlier crises during which Germany felt encircled by rival nations. Patriotic fervor swept through the population, strengthening the government's resolve to act decisively. In France, the assassination was initially viewed as a distant event, but the crisis gained urgency as Germany's intentions became clearer. French newspapers warned that Germany might exploit the situation to strengthen its dominance in Europe. Public opinion rallied behind the alliance with Russia. Memories of the Franco-Prussian War and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine still burned deeply in the national consciousness. Many French citizens believed that Germany posed a continuing threat and that supporting Russia was essential to preserving French security. When war was declared, tens of thousands of French people gathered in public squares to hear the news. The scenes were dramatic and emotional. Crowds shouted patriotic slogans and sang national songs. Young men volunteered eagerly, confident that their nation would prevail. They believed war would be swift and that France would reclaim its lost territories. This enthusiasm would soon collide with the grim reality of trench warfare, but in the early days, it bolstered the government's determination to fulfill its alliance obligations. Britain's public reaction was more subdued at first. The British people did not feel directly threatened by the assassination. They hoped the crisis could be resolved diplomatically. Many newspapers warned against being drawn into a continental war. But when Germany invaded Belgium, everything changed. Britain had signed a treaty guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality, and the violation of that neutrality angered the British public deeply. The invasion was portrayed as an act of unprovoked aggression. Sympathy for Belgium grew rapidly, as did support for Britain joining the war. Crowds gathered before the gates of Buckingham Palace, cheering when war was declared. What had been a hesitant population now became united behind the government's decision. Across all these nations, propaganda played a crucial role. Governments sought to shape public opinion by controlling information and emphasizing patriotic themes. Posters, newspapers, speeches, and rallies encouraged unity and sacrifice. Each nation portrayed itself as the defender of justice and portrayed its enemies as aggressors. These narratives made compromise harder. Once people believed that their nation's honor or survival was at stake, backing down became politically dangerous. The assassination thus had an impact far beyond its immediate political consequences. It stirred the emotions of millions, shaping how they viewed their own nations and their rivals. These emotions, in turn, influenced political leaders who knew they needed public support for the decisions they were making. A crisis that might once have been contained now gained momentum from the very populations who would soon bear the cost of war. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo itself, the investigation into the assassination and the trials that followed revealed the depth of the region's political tensions. Princip and the other conspirators saw themselves as freedom fighters. They believed they were striking a blow against oppression. But their actions occurred in a world far more interconnected than they understood. They did not foresee the chain reaction that would follow. In their minds, they were aiming at a specific political target, not igniting a global conflict. Yet the forces they helped unleash could not be contained. European powers, already divided by alliances and rivalries, moved rapidly toward war. The public outcry in each nation removed any remaining space for compromise. Leaders who might have otherwise sought peaceful solutions found themselves driven by national pride, political pressure, and strategic necessity. In the next part of the documentary, we will explore how the assassination and the early crisis were perceived outside Europe. We will examine the reactions in the United States, the Ottoman Empire, and other regions, showing how the world watched the opening moves of a conflict that would soon reach far beyond Europe's borders. Far beyond Europe's borders, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the crisis that followed were closely observed by governments, newspapers, and ordinary people. Although the war would initially be centered in Europe, the world was far more interconnected than ever before. Merchant ships crossed oceans daily, telegraph cables carried messages instantly across continents, and global trade linked empires in complex ways. The assassination, therefore, did not go unnoticed in distant lands. It was the beginning of a crisis that would eventually touch almost every part of the world. In the United States, reactions were mixed. America in 1914 was a rising industrial power, but it remained deeply committed to isolationism in foreign affairs. Most Americans saw European rivalries as old-world conflicts that did not concern them. Newspapers covered the assassination, but the event did not dominate public discourse until the situation escalated. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and the major powers began mobilizing, American observers grew more attentive. Some newspapers warned that Europe was rushing toward disaster. Others believed the conflict would be brief, perhaps lasting only a few months. President Woodrow Wilson expressed sorrow for the loss of life but reaffirmed that America would remain neutral. Neutrality, however, did not mean indifference. American businesses and banks had strong economic ties to Europe, particularly Britain and France. As the crisis deepened, financial markets grew anxious. Investors feared disruption to trade routes, and the New York Stock Exchange temporarily closed to prevent panic. The United States watched Europe slide toward war with a mixture of detachment and concern, unaware that before long it would be drawn into the conflict as well. In the Ottoman Empire, the assassination was seen through the lens of the empire's own struggles. The Ottoman state, once a dominant force across the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe, had been weakening for decades. It had recently lost nearly all its European territories during the Balkan Wars. Ottoman leaders saw the rising tensions between Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia as part of the ongoing power struggle in the Balkans. While the assassination itself did not immediately alter Ottoman policy, the crisis presented an opportunity. The Ottoman Empire sought allies to strengthen its position, and Germany had been cultivating Ottoman support for years. By the time war broke out, the Ottomans were leaning toward the German and Austro-Hungarian side. Their leadership believed that aligning with the Central Powers could help them regain lost influence and territory. Although the Ottoman Empire did not immediately enter the war in August 1914, the Sarajevo assassination would indirectly lead to its involvement later that year. In Britain's vast colonies, reactions varied widely. In India, newspapers reported the assassination but focused heavily on the diplomatic tension that followed. Indian leaders connected the crisis to larger debates about imperial loyalty and self-governance. When Britain declared war in August, India was automatically part of the conflict. Many Indian soldiers volunteered willingly, believing that supporting Britain might lead to political concessions in the future. Few realized the scale of sacrifice that would be demanded of them in the years ahead. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the assassination was viewed as a tragic event but not one demanding immediate attention. These dominions, however, were automatically at war when Britain entered the conflict. Their populations responded with significant enthusiasm, offering troops and support for the empire. Across the world, empires pulled their colonies and dominions into the conflict, expanding what had begun as a European war into a global one. In Japan, the assassination attracted diplomatic interest, though the Japanese public did not share Europe's intense anxiety. Japan was closely allied with Britain through the Anglo-Japanese alliance and saw the unfolding crisis as an opportunity to expand its influence in Asia. When war began, Japan declared war on Germany in August 1914, seeking to seize German territories in the Pacific and China. The assassination therefore set in motion events that would reshape power dynamics across Asia. In China, which was politically fragmented and struggling with internal instability, news of the assassination was noted but did not provoke major reaction. China was not aligned with any of the European alliances at the time. However, as the war progressed, China would later contribute labor forces to the Allied cause, further illustrating how global the conflict had become. In Latin America, reactions varied from country to country. Nations like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile observed the crisis primarily through commercial concerns. Europe was a major trading partner, and war threatened to disrupt important economic ties. Although most Latin American nations remained neutral at first, they watched developments closely. Some would later join the Allies, influenced by economic interests and diplomatic pressures. Across Africa, the assassination did not immediately influence daily life, yet its consequences would soon become unavoidable. Many African territories were under European colonial rule, tied to powers now entering war. France, Britain, Germany, and Belgium all controlled vast regions of the continent. As European armies mobilized, colonial governments began recruiting or conscripting African soldiers and workers for the war effort. The war would eventually be fought not only in Europe but in African territories such as German East Africa and German Cameroon. The assassination thus rippled across the world in ways the conspirators in Sarajevo could never have imagined. Local conflicts became global crises because Europe's imperial system connected distant continents to decisions made in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and London. Once the war was underway, its effects spread far beyond the battlefields. Trade routes changed, economies shifted, and political movements gained momentum. Independence movements in colonized regions took inspiration from the war, understanding that the old imperial order was weakening under the strain of global conflict. Even in places where the assassination was initially seen as a distant event, its consequences soon became part of daily life. Families in India, Africa, and the Pacific found their sons recruited into armies fighting thousands of kilometers away. Merchant ships from South America and Asia encountered new dangers on seas patrolled by warring navies. The United States, despite its desire for neutrality, faced increasing economic and political pressure that would eventually draw it into the struggle. But while the global reactions reveal the vast reach of the conflict, the story of how a single assassination triggered such worldwide consequences also lies in the personalities and decisions of key individuals. Diplomacy, pride, misjudgment, and miscommunication played profound roles in shaping the crisis. Nations made choices driven by fear of appearing weak, by memories of past conflicts, and by ambitions for territorial or political gain. The next part of this documentary will examine these decisions more closely, focusing on the leaders whose interpretations of the assassination shaped the course of history. The outbreak of the First World War cannot be understood without examining the key figures whose decisions shaped the crisis of 1914. These individuals, each with their own beliefs, ambitions, fears, and limitations, interpreted the assassination of Franz Ferdinand through the lens of national interest. Their judgments, shaped by personal character as much as political circumstance, played a decisive role in transforming a regional tragedy into a global war. In Austria-Hungary, one of the most influential voices during the July crisis was Count Leopold Berchtold, the empire's foreign minister. Berchtold had long believed that Serbia posed a threat to imperial stability. For years, he had faced criticism for being too passive in defending Austrian influence in the Balkans. After the assassination, he saw an opportunity to assert the empire's authority. Yet Berchtold was not a forceful leader. He relied heavily on advisors and military officials who urged a strong response. He feared that any sign of weakness would embolden nationalist movements within the empire. Under pressure, he supported drafting the ultimatum to Serbia, carefully designed to be rejected. Berchtold understood the risks but believed that Austria-Hungary must act decisively to maintain its status as a great power. Alongside Berchtold stood General Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. Conrad had long advocated for war against Serbia, seeing it as the only way to preserve the empire. For years before the assassination, he had repeatedly argued for a preventive strike. The assassination seemed to validate his warnings about Serbia's ambitions. Conrad's belief that the empire must act swiftly and forcefully influenced Vienna's decisions profoundly. He considered a military confrontation inevitable and believed that delaying action would make Austria-Hungary appear weak. Emperor Franz Joseph, though old and weary, remained the symbolic head of the empire. His personal relationship with Franz Ferdinand had been strained, but he understood that the assassination was a direct attack on the monarchy. While not the driving force behind the ultimatum or the declaration of war, the emperor approved the decisions made by his ministers and generals. His approval gave legitimacy to aggressive policies. Franz Joseph believed that defending the empire's honor was essential, even as he lamented the tragedy that had struck his family. Serbia's political response was shaped largely by its prime minister, Nikola Pašić. A cautious and pragmatic leader, Pašić understood that Serbia was in a precarious position. He had no desire for war with Austria-Hungary, knowing that Serbia was exhausted after the Balkan Wars and vulnerable to attack. When the ultimatum arrived, Pašić recognized that most demands were intentionally unacceptable. Yet he attempted to avoid war by crafting a conciliatory response. He sought to appear cooperative while preserving Serbia's sovereignty. Pašić hoped that diplomacy might buy time or encourage foreign intervention. But he also faced nationalist pressure at home, where many believed that resisting Austria-Hungary was a matter of national pride. Pašić walked a dangerous line, striving to defend Serbia's interests without provoking annihilation. Behind the scenes in Serbia was Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, better known by his codename Apis. As the head of Serbia's military intelligence and one of the founders of the Black Hand, Apis was a shadowy and powerful figure. His exact role in the assassination remains debated by historians. While the Serbian government may not have authorized the plot, Apis and other nationalist officers likely played a part in supplying the assassins with weapons and training. Apis believed that Serbia should lead the unification of the South Slavs and saw Austria-Hungary as the primary obstacle. To him, the assassination was part of a broader struggle for national liberation. He underestimated the consequences that would follow. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II faced overwhelming pressure during the crisis. Nicholas was a sensitive and indecisive ruler, deeply committed to his role as protector of the Slavic peoples. He saw himself as morally obligated to support Serbia. Yet he also feared war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Nicholas often hesitated, issuing orders only to reverse them hours later. His uncertainty contributed to the chaotic mobilization decisions that Germany interpreted as preparation for war. The Tsar wrote emotional letters to Kaiser Wilhelm, hoping to avoid conflict, but he lacked the political strength to resist his generals and advisors, who insisted that Russia must act decisively. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II remains one of the most controversial figures of the era. His personality was marked by impulsiveness, pride, and a desire for international prestige. Wilhelm was deeply saddened by the assassination, expressing sympathy for Austria-Hungary, but he initially believed the crisis could be resolved without war. Yet his views shifted as diplomatic tensions increased. Wilhelm wanted Germany to be respected and feared, and he believed that supporting Austria-Hungary was essential to maintaining Germany's position in Europe. His government issued the blank check, assuring Vienna of Germany's unconditional support. This was one of the most consequential decisions of the crisis. Wilhelm later tried to halt the escalation, but by then the military machinery had already been set in motion. His inability to control his own generals contributed to the chain reaction that followed. Germany's political leadership, including Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, shared the belief that Germany must support Austria-Hungary to avoid diplomatic isolation. Bethmann-Hollweg was not a militarist, but he feared that failing to stand by Austria would weaken Germany dramatically. He hoped the conflict could be contained, but he was also prepared to escalate if necessary. His diplomatic efforts during the crisis were inconsistent, at times urging caution and at other times encouraging Austria to act firmly. Germany's military leadership, especially Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, played an enormous role. Moltke was deeply committed to the Schlieffen Plan, a rigid strategy requiring immediate offensive action against France if war with Russia occurred. Moltke believed that Germany could not afford delay. Once Russia mobilized, he insisted that Germany must implement the plan. This belief left little room for diplomacy. When Germany declared war on Russia and France, it was largely because military leaders feared losing the strategic advantage of striking first. France's leadership also faced immense pressure. President Raymond Poincaré was a strong supporter of the alliance with Russia and believed that France must remain firm in the face of German aggression. Poincaré saw the crisis as a test of France's resolve. Prime Minister René Viviani, though more cautious, also recognized the importance of supporting Russia. French military leaders argued that Germany was preparing for war and that France could not hesitate. Memories of humiliation at the hands of Germany in the Franco-Prussian War influenced every decision. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey played central roles. Grey, in particular, struggled to balance Britain's desire for peace with its long-standing commitment to maintaining the balance of power in Europe. Britain was not bound to France or Russia by formal alliance, but it was tied to France through years of cooperation and to Belgium through a treaty guaranteeing its neutrality. Grey hoped to mediate the crisis and avoid war, but when Germany invaded Belgium, the choice was made for him. Britain could not stand aside. When Grey announced that Britain was entering the war, he looked out his office window and remarked that the lamps were going out all over Europe, and that they would not be lit again in his lifetime. These leaders did not seek world war, yet their decisions played decisive roles in bringing it about. Each acted based on national interest, personal beliefs, and the pressures of their political environments. Yet few understood the scale of destruction their choices would unleash. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand mattered not only because of the act itself, but because of how these leaders responded. The next part of the documentary will shift back to the Balkans to explore the long-term historical tensions that set the stage for conflict. We will examine the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of nationalism, and the previous Balkan conflicts that shaped the political landscape into which the assassination fell, creating a region primed for war. To fully understand why the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand escalated into a global conflict, we must return to the Balkans, a region long known as the powder keg of Europe. For centuries, the Balkans had been shaped by empires, migrations, religious divisions, and competing national identities. By the early 20th century, these tensions reached a peak, creating conditions in which a single act of violence could ignite far-reaching consequences. Much of the region's instability stemmed from the decline of the Ottoman Empire. For hundreds of years, the Ottomans ruled over vast territories in southeastern Europe, including what are now Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia. But by the 19th century, the empire was weakening, losing territory and struggling to maintain control over its provinces. The decline created a vacuum that local national movements quickly filled. Inspired by ideas of nationalism sweeping across Europe, various peoples of the Balkans sought independence or territorial expansion. The first major blow to Ottoman power in Europe came with the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, followed by uprisings in Serbia and Romania. These movements inspired others, leading to the emergence of independent Balkan states. But as the Ottomans weakened, rivalries among these new nations grew. Serbia sought to expand into territories inhabited by Serbs under Ottoman or Austro-Hungarian rule. Bulgaria dreamed of a greater Bulgarian state. Greece and Romania also harbored territorial ambitions. This competition created bitterness and suspicion among neighboring states. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, watched the region with deep concern. As the Ottoman Empire receded, Austria feared the spread of Slavic nationalism. Vienna believed that if Serbia became too powerful, Slavic populations within Austria-Hungary might demand independence, threatening the cohesion of the empire. This fear shaped much of Austria-Hungary's Balkan policy. The empire sought to maintain influence over Bosnia and other contested areas, hoping to control the spread of nationalism. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 attempted to manage the region's shifting political landscape. Austria-Hungary was granted the right to administer Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories still officially under Ottoman sovereignty. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania gained full independence, while Bulgaria received autonomy. But the decisions made at Berlin failed to resolve underlying tensions. Many ethnic groups remained under foreign rule, and rival nationalisms continued to grow. Austria-Hungary's administration of Bosnia created ongoing friction. Bosnia was home to a mix of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, each with their own distinct identity. Many Serbs in Bosnia resented Austrian rule and looked toward Serbia as their natural homeland. Austria's presence in Bosnia thus became a source of resentment for Serbian nationalists both inside and outside the empire. That resentment intensified in 1908 when Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. The annexation shocked Europe and outraged Serbia. It was seen as a bold and aggressive move by Vienna to expand its influence at Serbia's expense. Serbia, supported by Russia, protested vehemently but lacked the military strength to challenge Austria. The annexation crisis increased distrust between Serbia and Austria-Hungary and fueled nationalist anger among young Serbs who viewed the annexation as an act of imperial domination. These tensions did not diminish in the years that followed. Serbia continued to champion the idea of uniting all South Slavs under its leadership. This vision clashed directly with Austria-Hungary's efforts to preserve its multi-ethnic empire. The conflict between these two visions lay at the heart of the tensions that would erupt in 1914. The situation grew even more volatile with the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In the First Balkan War, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro formed the Balkan League and attacked the Ottoman Empire. The war was swift and decisive. The Ottomans were driven almost entirely out of Europe. Serbia expanded significantly, gaining territories in Kosovo and Macedonia. These victories enhanced Serbia's prestige and strengthened its position in the region. But success brought new disputes. The Balkan states quarreled over the division of their conquests. Bulgaria, dissatisfied with its share, launched an attack against its former allies in the Second Balkan War. This conflict ended disastrously for Bulgaria, which lost territory to Serbia, Greece, and Romania. Serbia emerged from the wars considerably stronger and more confident. Its population grew, its military improved, and its national pride soared. Austria-Hungary, however, viewed Serbia's growth with alarm. Vienna believed that a powerful Serbia threatened the stability of the empire. The expansion of Serbia also encouraged nationalist sentiment among Slavs living under Austrian rule. Many Austro-Hungarian leaders concluded that confrontation with Serbia was inevitable. General Konrad von Hötzendorf repeatedly urged war against Serbia, believing that delaying action would only strengthen Serbia further. The imperial leadership felt trapped between declining influence and growing nationalist pressure. Russia, for its part, emerged from the Balkan Wars with increased determination to support Serbia. Russia and Austria-Hungary had long competed for influence in the Balkans. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations and Orthodox Christians. The wars deepened this commitment. Russia feared that allowing Austria-Hungary to crush Serbia would weaken its own position. This rivalry meant that any conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia risked drawing in Russia as well. Against this backdrop of nationalism, imperial rivalry, and competing territorial ambitions, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand took on far greater meaning. To Austrian leaders, it was not simply a terrorist act but the culmination of years of Serbian hostility. They believed Serbia had undermined the empire's authority for too long. To Serbian nationalists, the assassination symbolized resistance to foreign rule. They did not foresee the overwhelming reaction their actions would provoke. The Balkans had long been unstable, but by 1914 the region had become a crucible of unresolved tensions. Austria-Hungary felt threatened by Serbian nationalism. Serbia felt empowered by recent victories. Russia felt obligated to defend Serbia. These forces created an environment in which the assassination could not remain an isolated event. It struck at the heart of a regional struggle over identity, territory, and power. The next part of the documentary will return to the assassination itself, exploring in greater depth the experiences, motivations, and backgrounds of the young conspirators. We will examine their journey into radical nationalism, their recruitment, training, and the final preparations that led them to Sarajevo on that fateful morning. Their story provides crucial insight into the minds of those whose actions would alter the course of world history. The young men who carried out the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not imagine themselves influencing world history. They believed they were acting for their people, striking a blow against an empire they saw as oppressive. To understand why they embraced such extreme action, we must look closely at their lives, their beliefs, and the environment that shaped them. These were not hardened soldiers but idealistic youths shaped by poverty, nationalism, and the political tensions of the Balkans. Gavrilo Princip, the man who fired the fatal shots, was born in 1894 in the small village of Obiljic, in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. His family lived in modest circumstances, struggling with the harsh realities of rural life. Princip's father was a postman and a devout Orthodox Christian who believed in humility and discipline. But young Princip grew up surrounded by stories of resistance, suffering, and national identity. The annexation of Bosnia by Austria-Hungary in 1908 deeply affected him. He viewed it as unjust and felt that his people were living under foreign domination. As a teenager, Princip moved to Sarajevo for schooling. It was there that he encountered a world far different from his rural upbringing. Sarajevo was a crossroads of cultures, religions, and political movements. It was also filled with resentment against imperial rule. Princip joined a youth group called Young Bosnia, which attracted students, intellectuals, and idealists who believed in Slavic unity and independence. They discussed political theory, poetry, revolution, and philosophy. For them, nationalism was not simply a political belief but a moral duty. Young Bosnia members were influenced by Russian revolutionary literature, Serbian nationalism, and European ideas of self-determination. Princip was small in stature and physically frail, which made him unable to join some of the more formal revolutionary groups at first. But he possessed a fierce determination and a deep sense of purpose. He admired those who had taken bold action for national liberation. Over time, he grew increasingly committed to the idea that freedom required sacrifice. He believed that a symbolic act could inspire others and weaken the empire's control. Nedeljko Kabranovic, who threw the bomb earlier that morning, shared similar motivations. Born in Sarajevo in 1895, Kabranovic had also grown up amid the empire's ethnic tensions. As a young man, he worked as a typesetter and became involved in anarchist and nationalist movements. He distributed pamphlets, participated in protests, and sought a way to contribute to what he saw as the struggle for liberation. Kabranovic's worldview combined anarchist ideals with nationalist sentiment, leading him to believe that dramatic action was necessary to shake the political order. Trifko Grabez, another conspirator, was born in Herzegovina in 1895. Like Princip, he grew up in poverty and felt the weight of political injustice in daily life. His path to radicalism was shaped by the nationalist fervor that spread among young Slavs during the early 20th century. He too joined Young Bosnia and became dedicated to the cause of independence. These young men did not act alone. Their beliefs and ambitions connected them to a wider network of nationalist organizations. The most notable of these was the Black Hand, a secret society formed by Serbian military officers in 1911. The Black Hand operated independently of the Serbian government, though some senior officials were sympathetic to its goals. The organization sought to unite all Serbs under one state and often used covert methods, including propaganda, sabotage, and assassination. Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, known as Apis, was one of the leaders of the Black Hand. He had played a role in the 1903 coup that brought a new dynasty to power in Serbia. Apis believed deeply in the cause of South Slavic unity and saw Austria-Hungary as the primary obstacle. Under his influence, the Black Hand became increasingly involved in radical plots. While it is not clear whether Apis personally ordered the assassination, he or his associates provided the weapons, training, and logistical support that enabled the conspirators to act. The connection between Young Bosnia and the Black Hand was informal but significant. Young Bosnia supplied the passionate youths motivated by ideals, while the Black Hand offered the resources and expertise needed to carry out violent action. This combination proved deadly. In the spring of 1914, Princip, Kabranovic, and several others traveled to Belgrade, where they met intermediaries connected to the Black Hand. They were provided with pistols, bombs, ammunition, and cyanide pills. They received basic training in handling weapons and were instructed to return to Sarajevo quietly. The journey back to Bosnia required careful planning. The conspirators traveled in small groups, avoiding detection. They carried their weapons hidden in clothing and luggage. Along the way, they relied on sympathizers who helped them cross the border. The weapons eventually reached Sarajevo, where they were distributed among the participants. Each conspirator was assigned a position along the motorcade route that Franz Ferdinand would take through the city. The Archduke's visit to Sarajevo had been widely announced. He was inspecting military maneuvers and attending official ceremonies. The city was decorated with flags and banners, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. For nationalists, his visit symbolized imperial control over Bosnia. The date, June 28, was especially symbolic. It was Vidovdan, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a foundational moment in Serbian history. To hold an imperial event on such a significant day seemed provocative to many. As the conspirators took their positions that morning, they were nervous but committed. They understood that their chances of survival were low. Most expected to die, either during the attack or shortly afterward. Their cyanide capsules, intended to prevent capture, were old and unreliable, but they believed they would not be taken alive. When the motorcade began, the conspirators watched carefully. Mehmed Basic, the first man in line, hesitated. He later claimed the police presence was too heavy. Kabranovic, however, seized his moment and threw his bomb. When it exploded under the wrong car, chaos erupted. The conspirators scattered, believing the plot had failed. Princip, disheartened, wandered through the city, uncertain of what to do next. But fate intervened. After the reception at City Hall, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded at the hospital. The motorcade route was changed, but the lead driver was not properly informed. When the cars made a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, the vehicles slowed. Princip happened to be standing near a delicatessen at that exact moment. The Archduke's car halted just a few feet from him. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. His aim was deadly. Within moments, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife lay fatally wounded. Princip was seized by police before he could take his cyanide or turn his weapon on himself. The conspirators believed they had struck a blow for national liberation. They believed their act would weaken Austria-Hungary and strengthen the Slavic cause. But they did not foresee the consequences. They did not understand how interconnected Europe's alliances and rivalries had become. They could not predict that their actions would trigger mobilizations, ultimatums, and declarations of war. The next part of the documentary will explore the investigation that followed the attack, the trials of the conspirators, and how Austria-Hungary built its case against Serbia. This investigation shaped international opinion and played a central role in the escalating crisis that led Europe to war. In the hours and days following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Sarajevo became the center of an intense investigation. Authorities worked quickly to identify all those involved, unravel their connections, and determine whether the attack had been part of a broader conspiracy. The Austro-Hungarian government knew that the world was watching. They needed to prove that Serbia, directly or indirectly, bore responsibility for the act. The results of the investigation would form the foundation for the ultimatum sent to Serbia weeks later. Immediately after the shooting, Gavrilo Princip and several other conspirators were arrested. Princip was taken into custody bleeding from wounds sustained during the scuffle. He was interrogated repeatedly in the days that followed. Despite his youth and frail appearance, Princip answered questions with a combination of pride and defiance. He admitted his role without hesitation. He declared that he had acted for the liberation of his people, not out of personal hatred for Franz Ferdinand. But he denied that the Serbian government had ordered the attack. Princip insisted that he and his comrades were patriots acting independently, supported only by fellow nationalists. Nedeljko Kabranovic, who had tried to kill himself after throwing the bomb, survived the attempt and was arrested as well. His cyanide had been so old and diluted that it failed to kill him. He later recounted the failed bombing with a sense of fatalism. Like Princip, Kabranovic spoke openly about his motivations and admitted to receiving weapons from contacts in Serbia. He confirmed that the conspirators had been inspired by nationalist ideals and had received assistance from individuals connected to Serbian military circles. But he too denied that the Serbian government itself had authorized the attack. Under interrogation, the conspirators provided enough information for authorities to identify additional participants. Trifko Grabez, Veso Kubrilovic, Jetko Popovic, and several others were arrested in the days after the assassination. Some were caught in Sarajevo. Others were captured after attempting to flee. One conspirator, Muhammed Mehmed Basic, managed to escape into Montenegro and later returned to Serbia, avoiding arrest entirely. The authorities pieced together the basic details of the plot through interrogations, documents, and witness accounts. As more information emerged, it became clear that the assassination was not an isolated act carried out by a lone individual. It was a coordinated effort involving multiple young men, cross-border smuggling of weapons, and training provided by shadowy groups operating within Serbia. This strengthened Austria-Hungary's suspicion that Serbia bore responsibility. But the evidence did not clearly reveal the Serbian government's direct involvement. Rather, it pointed to members of nationalist movements and rogue intelligence officers acting independently or semi-independently, without explicit government approval. Despite the ambiguity, the Austro-Hungarian leadership believed that Serbia had nurtured an environment in which such violence could flourish. They argued that Serbia encouraged anti-Austrian propaganda, tolerated extremist groups, and allowed its military officers to assist radicals. For Vienna, these conditions constituted indirect responsibility. They believed Serbia must be held accountable not only for the actions of the conspirators but for the political culture that inspired and supported them. The investigation in Sarajevo continued throughout the summer. Austro-Hungarian officials compiled detailed reports describing the involvement of the conspirators and their connections to nationalist organizations. These reports would later be used to justify the demands included in the ultimatum to Serbia. However, the investigation was shaped by political motivations as much as by a desire for truth. Austria-Hungary sought to build a case strong enough to rally international support for decisive action against Serbia. As the investigation unfolded, tensions in Sarajevo remained high. The assassination sparked a wave of anti-Serbian riots. Mobs attacked Serbian-owned shops, homes, and institutions. People were beaten, property destroyed, and churches vandalized. Authorities struggled to control the violence, which reflected deep ethnic divisions within the city. The riots alarmed some Austro-Hungarian officials, who feared further unrest, but they also reinforced the belief that Serbia's presence and influence within the empire were destabilizing. The funeral of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie took place on July 3 in Vienna. The ceremony was solemn, but it lacked the grandeur some had expected for the heir to the throne. This was partly due to Franz Ferdinand's morganatic marriage. Because Sophie was of lesser nobility, she had not been fully accepted by the imperial court. Even in death, she was denied certain honors customarily given to members of the imperial family. Their burial was private, attended by close friends rather than the full weight of the imperial aristocracy. Still, the assassination weighed heavily on Austria-Hungary's leaders. They saw it as an intolerable affront. Many believed that failing to respond forcefully would demonstrate weakness, encouraging nationalist movements within the empire and endangering its future. The political mood in Vienna shifted toward confrontation. Count Berchtold and General Konrad von Hötzendorf argued that Austria-Hungary must take advantage of the crisis to deal a decisive blow to Serbia. In Belgrade, Serbia received the news of the investigation with dread. Serbian leaders knew that the assassins had crossed the border, received weapons from individuals in Serbia, and returned to Bosnia to carry out the attack. They also knew that some Serbian military officers had likely been involved, even if the government itself had not sanctioned the plot. Prime Minister Nikola Pašic understood that Austria-Hungary would not accept excuses. Serbia remained vulnerable, recovering from recent wars and unable to withstand a full-scale invasion without support from Russia. Serbia launched its own investigation, attempting to demonstrate cooperation and goodwill. But Austria-Hungary dismissed these efforts as insufficient. Vienna believed only a forceful response could restore the empire's prestige. By early July, the political and military leadership had already begun preparing for war, even as diplomats attempted to frame the coming conflict as a justified act of defense. Meanwhile, the international community watched the crisis develop with growing unease. European diplomats understood that the situation in the Balkans had the potential to escalate. But few foresaw the scale of the conflict to come. Many believed that Austria-Hungary's demands would remain limited and manageable. Others hoped that diplomatic pressure from Germany or Russia might moderate the crisis. As the investigation in Sarajevo concluded, it became clear that tensions were rising far more quickly than anyone had anticipated. The next part of the documentary will explore the drafting of the July Ultimatum, one of the most aggressive diplomatic documents in modern European history. We will examine how Austria-Hungary constructed its demands, why the ultimatum was designed to be unacceptable, and how its delivery set the stage for the rapid collapse of peace in Europe. The July Ultimatum stands as one of the most pivotal documents in modern history. Crafted by Austria-Hungary in the weeks following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it served as the decisive step that pushed Europe from a diplomatic crisis into a full-scale war. To understand its impact, we must examine how it was written, what it demanded, and why Austria-Hungary knew Serbia could not accept it without sacrificing its sovereignty. After the investigation in Sarajevo produced evidence linking the assassins to nationalist circles in Serbia, Austria-Hungary's leadership believed that they had the justification they needed to confront their troublesome neighbor. Yet the decision to pursue a hard line was not purely a response to the assassination. It emerged from years of frustration, fear, and distrust. Austria-Hungary had been losing influence in the Balkans. Serbia had grown stronger after the Balkan Wars and was increasingly seen as the protector of South Slavic nationalism, a force that threatened the unity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Count Leopold Berchtold, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, along with General Konrad von Hötzendorf and other influential advisors, concluded that the empire must deal Serbia a decisive blow. But they also recognized the risks. Serbia was protected by Russia, a major power. Austria-Hungary could not act alone. This is why the blank check from Germany, delivered on July 5, was crucial. With Germany's unconditional support, Vienna felt emboldened. It could pursue aggressive measures knowing that its most powerful ally stood behind it. Work on the ultimatum began immediately after Germany's pledge. Berchtold and his team crafted the document with great care, shaping it to appear as a legitimate request for justice while ensuring its demands were so intrusive that Serbia could not accept them. The ultimatum contained 10 points, each addressing Austrian grievances. Some demands were reasonable and related directly to the assassination, such as suppressing anti-Austrian propaganda and arresting individuals suspected of involvement in the plot. But others struck at the heart of Serbian sovereignty. The most controversial demands required Serbia to allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in the investigation and suppression of anti-Austrian activities within Serbia. In effect, these demands would have allowed Austria-Hungary to operate within Serbia's borders, influencing its police, courts, and internal affairs. No independent nation could accept such interference without becoming a virtual protectorate of its rival. The ultimatum also required Serbia to dismiss certain military officers and government officials, individuals Austria-Hungary believed were connected to extremist nationalism. This was a direct attempt to weaken Serbia's political and military structures. Accepting such a demand would have been humiliating and dangerous for any government, especially one already facing domestic nationalist pressure. Despite the severity of the ultimatum, Austria-Hungary presented it as a reasonable document aimed at preventing future terrorist acts. But behind closed doors, Vienna's leaders admitted that their goal was not reconciliation but confrontation. They expected Serbia to reject the ultimatum, providing a diplomatic justification for war. Berchtold and his advisors believed that firm action was necessary to restore the empire's authority and deter nationalist movements within its borders. The ultimatum was delivered to Serbia on July 23. Serbia was given 48 hours to respond. In Belgrade, panic spread. Prime Minister Nikola Pašić was away on a political tour when the document arrived, and he hurried back to the capital. The Serbian cabinet met repeatedly, studying each point, debating their options. They understood the stakes. Serbia was militarily weaker than Austria-Hungary, financially strained, and still recovering from its recent wars. Without Russian support, Serbia could not hope to survive a major invasion. The Serbian government recognized that total acceptance of the ultimatum was impossible. The demands that undermined Serbia's sovereignty were beyond negotiation. But Pašić also knew that rejecting the ultimatum outright would give Austria-Hungary the excuse it wanted to declare war. Serbia's strategy, therefore, was to accept as many demands as possible while expressing willingness to negotiate the more problematic ones. The goal was to appear cooperative and peaceful, thereby garnering international support and portraying Austria-Hungary as the aggressor. Serbia's reply, delivered on July 25, was a diplomatic masterpiece. Serbia agreed to nearly all the demands, including measures to suppress extremist groups and strengthen law enforcement. But it could not accept Austrian officials operating within Serbia. Instead, Serbia proposed referring disputed points to the International Court at The Hague or to Great Powers for arbitration. The tone of the reply was humble and conciliatory, emphasizing Serbia's desire for peace. When Kaiser Wilhelm read Serbia's reply, he initially believed it was so accepting that it removed any justification for war. He called the document a capitulation of the most humiliating kind and expressed hope that Austria-Hungary would now be satisfied. But Vienna did not see it that way. Austria-Hungary had already decided on war. The conciliatory nature of Serbia's reply did not change that decision. Berchtold and Conrad interpreted Serbia's refusal to accept the key demand regarding infiltration of Austrian officials as a deliberate provocation. On July 25, Austria-Hungary severed diplomatic relations with Serbia. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war. The ultimatum achieved exactly what Vienna intended. It provided a formal, documented justification for aggressive action. It also forced other nations to respond. Russia, seeing Serbia under threat, began partial mobilization. Germany, tied to Austria-Hungary, promised military support. France began preparing its own forces. Britain watched warily, hoping to mediate but increasingly aware that German military plans might soon force its hand. The delivery of the ultimatum marked the moment when diplomacy began to crumble. The window for peaceful resolution closed rapidly. Though Serbia's reply offered a path to negotiation, Austria-Hungary rejected it entirely. The ultimatum was not designed to be accepted. It was designed to provoke. By issuing demands that no sovereign country could fully comply with, Austria-Hungary ensured that the crisis would escalate. The next part of the documentary will examine the final 72 hours before the outbreak of general war in Europe. This period, often called the final countdown to catastrophe, reveals how quickly events spiraled, how diplomacy failed, and how the decisions of a few leaders shaped the fate of millions. The final 72 hours before Europe descended into general war were marked by confusion, fear, miscommunication, and a growing sense that events had begun slipping beyond the control of any single leader. Even though no one in power openly sought a continent-wide conflict, the machinery of mobilization, the pressures of alliances, and the fear of appearing weak drove the great powers toward a catastrophe that diplomacy could no longer stop. During these critical days, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was no longer the central issue. It had become the spark that ignited long-buried rivalries and deep-rooted anxieties. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia. Artillery fire thundered across the Danube as shells struck Belgrade. For Austria-Hungary's leaders, the bombardment was an assertion of strength and a message to the world that the empire would no longer tolerate Serbian nationalism. But for Serbia, the attack confirmed their worst fear: Austria-Hungary was determined to destroy them. Serbian officials immediately appealed to Russia, pleading that only Russian support could prevent Serbia's annihilation. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II faced enormous pressure. As the self-proclaimed protector of all Slavic peoples, Russia could not afford to abandon Serbia without suffering a humiliating loss of prestige. Nationalists, military leaders, and influential ministers urged the Tsar to act decisively. Yet Nicholas was torn. He did not want war with Austria-Hungary, and he feared even more the possibility of war with Germany. But the bombardment of Belgrade left little room for hesitation. After hours of deliberation, Nicholas approved a partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary on July 29, hoping this limited show of force would deter further aggression. Partial mobilization soon proved impractical. Russia's vast military system could not mobilize in pieces. Railways, depots, and units were interconnected. Partial mobilization created confusion and risked leaving Russia dangerously exposed if Germany intervened. The Russian generals insisted that only full mobilization could ensure the army's readiness. They warned Nicholas that delay would leave Russia helpless if Germany decided to support Austria-Hungary with force. The Tsar wavered again, torn between caution and obligation. But by evening on July 30, under mounting pressure, he approved full mobilization of the Russian armed forces. This single decision dramatically escalated the crisis. For Germany, Russian mobilization was the one event that military planners had long considered intolerable. Germany's entire war strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, rested on the assumption that if Russia mobilized, Germany must act immediately. The plan was rigid. It allowed no pause, no negotiation, and no gradual steps. Once Russia mobilized, Germany would have to mobilize as well, attack France first, and then turn eastward against Russia. Delay would give Russia time to bring its massive armies to full strength. German generals warned that failing to strike quickly would be a fatal mistake. Meanwhile, Kaiser Wilhelm II continued exchanging telegrams with Tsar Nicholas. These messages, famously known as the Willy-Nicky telegrams, reveal two monarchs desperately trying to preserve peace even as events raced ahead of them. Nicholas begged Wilhelm to restrain Austria-Hungary and halt the march toward war. Wilhelm pleaded with Nicholas to stop Russian mobilization. But neither man controlled the forces now in motion. Their generals, advisors, and diplomats had already made decisions that set the crisis on a path from which neither monarch could easily turn back. On July 31, Germany proclaimed a state of imminent danger of war. The German government sent ultimatums to both Russia and France. To Russia, Germany demanded that all mobilizations cease at once. To France, Germany demanded clarity on whether France intended to support Russia in the event of war. These ultimatums were delivered with deadlines, and both were framed in a way that made refusal almost inevitable. Russia, facing enormous internal pressure, could not simply reverse mobilization without crippling its military readiness. France, bound by alliance and eager to avoid diplomatic isolation, refused to abandon Russia. When the deadlines expired, Germany responded. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. The next step came almost automatically. Germany activated the Schlieffen Plan, which required the rapid movement of German forces through neutral Belgium to attack France from the north. German leaders believed that France would mobilize in support of Russia and that Germany must therefore strike first. They also believed that violating Belgian territory was a strategic necessity. Diplomacy mattered less than military tempo. On August 2, Germany sent an ultimatum to Belgium demanding free passage for its troops. Belgium, despite facing an enormous military power, refused. Its government insisted that national sovereignty was not negotiable. Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality directly affected Britain. For years, British foreign policy had rested on maintaining the balance of power in Europe. Britain had no formal alliance requiring it to fight alongside France or Russia, but it had signed a treaty guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality. More importantly, Britain could not allow Germany to dominate the Western European coastline and threaten British security. In London, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey convened urgent meetings. The British cabinet was divided. Some ministers believed Britain should remain out of the conflict. Others argued that failing to act would leave Germany far too powerful. The invasion of Belgium transformed the debate. Newspapers across Britain denounced Germany's aggression. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace demanding action. Grey recognized that Britain's position was untenable. If Germany crushed France and controlled Belgium, the balance of power in Europe would be destroyed. On August 4, Britain issued an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw from Belgium or face war. Germany ignored it. When the deadline passed that evening, Britain declared war on Germany. At this moment, the July crisis ended and the First World War began. In less than 72 hours, what had started as a localized conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had spiraled into a multi-front confrontation drawing in all of Europe's great powers. The escalation was not caused by a single misstep but by a chain of interconnected decisions driven by alliances, military plans, national pride, and mutual suspicion. Austria-Hungary never believed Russia would intervene so strongly. Germany never believed Britain would go to war over Belgium. Russia never believed Germany would launch such a swift and aggressive response. France believed that standing by Russia would deter Germany, not provoke it. And Britain hoped to mediate until the final moment, only to find its hand forced by German military strategy. In these final days, diplomacy collapsed under the weight of rigid mobilization schedules and the fear of strategic disadvantage. Leaders who sought peace were trapped by the very military systems designed to protect their nations. None of the decisions taken in those 72 hours guaranteed a world war, yet together they made one almost inevitable. And so, Europe marched toward conflict. Trains filled with young men rolled across the countryside. Churches held services for departing soldiers. Families kissed their sons goodbye, believing they would return before the winter. Across the continent, a sense of patriotic excitement mixed with anxiety. No one fully understood the magnitude of the storm that had been unleashed. The belief in a rapid, decisive victory blinded millions to the reality that the world they knew was ending. In the next part of the documentary, we will follow the opening military movements of the war, the German invasion of Belgium, the French and Russian mobilizations, and the first battles that shattered the illusion of a short conflict and marked the beginning of the long, brutal struggle that became the First World War. When Europe finally crossed the threshold into war in early August 1914, the sense of momentum was overwhelming. Mobilization orders spread across cities and countryside alike. Railway stations filled with soldiers assembling under banners and marching bands. Crowds waved flags, tossed flowers, and shouted patriotic slogans, believing they were witnessing the beginning of a glorious but brief conflict. Governments promised a swift victory. Generals spoke confidently of decisive battles that would restore national pride and secure their nation's futures. But beneath the surface of excitement lay the grim reality of modern, industrialized warfare that few truly understood. The German invasion of Belgium, the first major military operation of the war, began with speed and determination. Germany's entire war strategy depended on the Schlieffen Plan, a blueprint designed to avoid a prolonged two-front confrontation. The plan called for the bulk of Germany's forces to swing through Belgium and northern France, encircle the French army, capture Paris, and force France to surrender quickly. Only then would Germany turn eastward to confront Russia, whose vast distances and slower mobilization timetable were expected to give Germany time to secure victory in the west. Belgium, however, did not intend to simply allow German forces to pass through its territory. Though small, Belgium was fiercely protective of its sovereignty. When Germany's ultimatum arrived demanding free passage, King Albert and his government firmly rejected it. They argued that defending their neutrality was not only a matter of national honor but a legal obligation under treaties guaranteed by the great powers. Belgium's refusal surprised German commanders, who had expected little resistance. On August 4, German troops crossed the Belgian frontier. The Belgian army fought with determination, though its numbers and equipment were no match for Germany's powerful and highly organized forces. The first major obstacle the Germans encountered was the fortified city of Liège. The forts around Liège were modern and formidable, and the Belgian defenders put up a fierce resistance. For days, German forces struggled to break through. Their timetable began to slip. This delay, though small in the broader scope of the war, disrupted the precision upon which the Schlieffen Plan depended. To overcome the Belgian forts, Germany deployed enormous siege artillery, including the massive howitzers known as Big Berthas. These guns, capable of firing shells of extraordinary size and destructive power, reduced fortifications that had been considered nearly indestructible. The fall of Liège opened the way for German forces to push deeper into Belgium, but the unexpected delay allowed France and Britain valuable time to prepare their defenses. Belgian resistance did more than slow the German advance. It sparked outrage across Europe. Reports of civilian casualties, destroyed towns, and harsh German reprisals created a wave of sympathy for Belgium and anger toward Germany. British newspapers seized upon the invasion to justify Britain's entry into the war, portraying Germany as a nation willing to trample the rights of a smaller country. The defense of Belgium became a rallying cry for the Allied cause. As Germany advanced westward, France prepared to execute its own war plan, known as Plan 17. This strategy, shaped by years of military doctrine emphasizing offensive action, called for French forces to launch an immediate assault into Alsace and Lorraine, territories France had lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. French commanders believed that offensive spirit and rapid movement would enable them to reclaim lost land and strike at the heart of German power. French troops, wearing bright blue coats and red trousers, marched with enthusiasm toward battle. The French public viewed the offensive as an opportunity to restore national pride. However, the war they entered was far different from the conflicts of previous generations. German forces, equipped with modern machine guns, heavy artillery, and well-prepared defensive positions, inflicted devastating casualties. The French discovered quickly that bravery alone could not overcome the destructive power of industrial weaponry. Meanwhile, the British Expeditionary Force, though small compared to the armies of continental Europe, landed in France to support the French in stopping the German advance. The British soldiers were highly trained and professional, veterans of colonial campaigns around the world. Their presence provided critical reinforcement as the German army swept through Belgium and into northern France. The first major clash between British and German forces occurred at Mons on August 23. The British troops fought with remarkable skill, using disciplined rifle fire to hold back waves of German infantry. But the overwhelming size of the German army forced the British to retreat. This began a long, difficult withdrawal known as the Great Retreat, during which British and French forces fell back toward the Marne River, attempting to reorganize and avoid encirclement. As German troops pushed closer to Paris, panic began to spread among the French population. Refugees fled the countryside. Government officials prepared for the possibility that the capital might fall, just as it had during the Franco-Prussian War. However, the German army was becoming overstretched. Their supply lines grew longer and more vulnerable. Exhaustion set in. Communications faltered. The precise coordination required by the Schlieffen Plan began to crumble. In early September, the French army, reinforced by the British, launched a counteroffensive at the First Battle of the Marne. The battle was massive and chaotic, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers across a wide front. French commanders used taxis from Paris to rush reinforcements to the front, a dramatic symbol of national unity and determination. After days of fierce fighting, the German advance stalled. Unable to break through and facing the threat of being flanked, the German commanders ordered a retreat to the north. This retreat marked the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany would not achieve a swift victory in the west. Instead, both sides began digging defensive trenches. What had started as a war of rapid movement now transformed into a war of attrition. The trench lines soon extended from the North Sea to the Swiss border, creating a vast, fortified stalemate that would last for years. On the Eastern Front, events unfolded with equal intensity. Russia, despite the challenges of mobilizing its massive army, launched early offensives into East Prussia and Galicia. Russian troops achieved initial successes against Austria-Hungary, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing territory. But against Germany, the Russians suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August. German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff orchestrated a brilliant encirclement that crushed an entire Russian army. The scale of the defeat shocked Russia and revealed the weaknesses in its logistical and command structures. Despite these setbacks, Russia's continued pressure forced Germany to divert troops from the Western Front, weakening its position there and further undermining the original German strategy. The multi-front nature of the war quickly became a strain on all the major powers, each of which had underestimated the resources, manpower, and time required to wage such a vast conflict. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary struggled badly against Serbia. Expecting a quick victory, Austrian forces launched repeated offensives but encountered fierce Serbian resistance. The Serbians, hardened by recent Balkan wars, fought with determination and local knowledge. Despite being outnumbered and poorly equipped, they inflicted significant losses on the Austro-Hungarian army. Austria-Hungary's failures in Serbia were humiliating and diverted attention from the larger strategic picture. What Vienna had hoped would be a swift, punishing campaign became a drawn-out struggle. By the end of 1914, the war was far from the short, decisive conflict many had imagined. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. France remained unconquered. Russia, though wounded, continued to fight. Britain had committed itself fully to the Allied cause. Austria-Hungary suffered defeats in Serbia. The Western Front had solidified into trenches that hinted at a long, grinding war with no clear end in sight. In the next part of the documentary, we will explore how the early months of the war transformed societies across Europe, how governments adapted to the realities of prolonged conflict, and how the tragedy born from the assassination of an archduke evolved into one of the deadliest wars the world has ever known. As 1914 gave way to 1915, the early illusions of a fast and glorious war faded across Europe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the furious exchange of ultimatums, the rapid mobilizations, and the opening battles had all happened with dizzying speed. But now the conflict settled into something far more grueling. The great powers realized they were no longer fighting a limited war but a vast struggle of endurance, industry, and national will. The assassination had set events in motion, but the war that now unfolded took on a life of its own. On the Western Front, the unsuccessful German advance and the French and British counterattack at the Marne led to the vast trench system that would define the war. What had been open fields and rolling countryside became a labyrinth of mud, barbed wire, dugouts, sandbags, and ruined earth. Soldiers began to experience the reality of trench warfare, the stench of stagnant water, the constant threat of artillery, the fear of snipers, and the ever-present danger of disease. Days passed in monotony, punctuated by sudden terror. Night brought quiet movement, patrols in no man's land, and the constant feeling of being watched by an enemy only a few hundred meters away. The generals on both sides quickly discovered that old tactics were hopelessly outdated. Mass infantry charges, once the backbone of 19th-century warfare, resulted in staggering casualties when attempted against machine guns, rapid-fire rifles, and entrenched positions. The Battle of the Frontiers, the Battle of Mons, and the battles that followed had shown that courage alone could not break fortified lines. Yet throughout 1915 and 1916, commanders continued to struggle with these new realities, often with tragic results. At the same time, Europe's soldiers were adjusting to technologies that were reshaping the nature of conflict. Artillery, rather than infantry, became the dominant force on the battlefield. Massive bombardments destroyed trenches, shattered nerves, and turned landscapes into wastelands. The psychological impact of shellfire became one of the defining experiences of the war. Telephones, railways, and telegraphs allowed armies to coordinate on a scale never seen before. Airplanes, primitive but rapidly evolving, began to take on reconnaissance roles and later offensive missions. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front developed very differently from the Western Front. There, the conflict remained more mobile. Russia suffered both victories and crushing defeats, and the size of the front created huge logistical challenges. The German victory at Tannenberg had been devastating, yet Russia's enormous manpower allowed it to remain in the fight. Austria-Hungary continued to struggle in Galicia and the Carpathians, relying increasingly on German support. Each setback reminded Vienna that its empire was weakening under the pressures of modern war. The Balkans, where the conflict had begun, remained a crucial region. Austria-Hungary's repeated failures to defeat Serbia exposed the empire's military weaknesses. Serbia, despite exhaustion and shortages, resisted with remarkable resilience. But by late 1915, Germany and Austria-Hungary launched a coordinated offensive, joined by Bulgaria, which saw an opportunity to settle territorial disputes. Serbia was overwhelmed. Its army retreated through the mountains of Albania in one of the most tragic episodes of the war. Thousands perished from hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. Yet the Serbian army survived, regrouping on the island of Corfu, ready to fight again alongside the Allies. Across Europe, the first winter of the war tested civilians as much as soldiers. Governments introduced rationing as food supplies grew strained. Factories shifted to war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in munitions plants, transportation, and administration. The boundaries between civilian and military life blurred. The war touched every home, every family, every town. Censorship increased as governments sought to control public opinion and maintain morale. Newspapers printed optimistic headlines, often masking the grim realities at the front. Propaganda campaigns flourished, portraying the enemy as barbaric and their own cause as just. Even as casualties mounted, governments encouraged belief in eventual victory, insisting that perseverance would bring triumph. The economic demands of the war transformed national economies. Countries borrowed money, raised taxes, and printed currency to finance armies of millions. Each passing month deepened the economic commitment, making it increasingly difficult for any nation to contemplate withdrawing from the conflict without victory. In neutral countries, reactions to the war varied. The United States remained officially neutral, though its sympathies increasingly leaned toward the Allies. American banks extended massive loans to Britain and France, and factories supplied weapons and material. Although President Woodrow Wilson insisted America must remain impartial, trade patterns, propaganda, and reports of German actions in Belgium steadily influenced public opinion. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. Its decision was influenced by German diplomacy and the belief that aligning with Germany offered the best chance to regain lost prestige and territory. The Ottoman entry expanded the war into the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Dardanelles. The conflict at Gallipoli, driven by Allied attempts to force open the straits to supply Russia, became one of the most dramatic and costly campaigns of the early war. As the war expanded geographically, the human cost grew rapidly. Millions of soldiers were already killed, wounded, or missing by the end of 1915. The war had become a global struggle, drawing in colonies, protectorates, and distant nations whose people found themselves fighting in unfamiliar lands. Indian troops fought in France and Mesopotamia. African soldiers fought in German colonies. Australians and New Zealanders fought at Gallipoli. Canadians fought at Ypres, where chlorine gas was used on a large scale for the first time. Yet despite all this suffering, victory remained distant. None of the major powers expected the war to continue into 1916, let alone 1918. The early assumption of a short, sharp war had collapsed completely. What now existed was a prolonged contest of attrition in which each nation believed that endurance alone might eventually break the will of the others. It is striking to remember that all of this, every front, every battle, every loss, every shattered empire, flowed from a moment on a Sarajevo street when a young man with a pistol acted on a belief that violence could change the fate of nations. The war that emerged from that act had long ceased to resemble the world the conspirators knew. It had evolved into something vast, impersonal, and relentless. In the next part of the documentary, we will follow the war through 1916 and 1917, when the scale of destruction reached unprecedented levels, when empires began to falter under the strain, and when new forces emerged that would reshape the world that came afterward. By 1916, the war that had begun with the assassination of a single archduke had grown into a vast and grinding conflict that reshaped every corner of Europe and far beyond. The combatants entered the year exhausted but determined, convinced that only through immense sacrifice could victory be secured. Yet as the months unfolded, it became clear that the war was not merely a clash of armies, but a colossal test of national endurance in which entire societies were mobilized, drained, and transformed. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than on the Western Front. The trench lines had solidified into a nearly immovable barrier stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss frontier. Thousands of kilometers of trenches, dugouts, communication lines, and barbed wire created a landscape so devastated that observers described it as resembling the surface of another planet. In this desolate environment, both sides prepared for massive offensives that they believed would finally break the stalemate. Germany struck first. In February 1916, they launched an assault on the French fortress city of Verdun. Verdun was not only a strategically important position, but a place of profound symbolic value to the French people. The German High Command, led by General Erich von Falkenhayn, believed that attacking Verdun would force France to defend the position at any cost. Falkenhayn famously intended to bleed France white by inflicting unsustainable losses. The battle that followed became one of the longest and most brutal in human history. Over the course of 10 months, French and German forces fought relentlessly amid shattered forts, ruined villages, and forests splintered by artillery fire. The air vibrated constantly with the crash of shells, the scream of wounded men, and the grinding sounds of war machines struggling through mud and rubble. French soldiers rotated through Verdun under the rallying cry "They shall not pass," a vow to defend the city regardless of the cost. By the time the battle ended in December 1916, casualties on both sides numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The front line moved only a few kilometers, but Verdun became a symbol of national endurance and the terrible futility of attrition warfare. Neither France nor Germany emerged with any meaningful strategic advantage. What they gained instead was a grim understanding that the war had become a struggle not for territory but for survival itself. As Verdun raged, the Allies prepared their own massive offensive on the Somme River. Originally intended to relieve pressure on Verdun and break through German lines, the Somme offensive began on July 1, 1916, with the largest artillery bombardment the British Army had ever conducted. British commanders believed the bombardment would destroy German defenses and allow infantry to advance across no man's land with minimal resistance. But the German defenses were deeper and stronger than anticipated. When the British infantry climbed out of their trenches at dawn on July 1, they faced intact machine guns, extensive barbed wire, and well-fortified positions. What followed was one of the bloodiest days in British military history. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed in a single day, and tens of thousands more were wounded. The months that followed brought further misery as both sides fought over a devastated landscape in battles that yielded little ground at enormous cost. The Somme, like Verdun, became a symbol of the senseless slaughter of trench warfare. By the end of the campaign in November 1916, more than 1 million men had been killed or wounded, yet the front lines had barely shifted. The war was no longer defined by quick maneuvers or decisive victories but by slow, grinding battles of attrition. While the Western Front dominated public attention, other fronts played crucial roles. In the East, Russia launched the Brusilov offensive in the summer of 1916, one of the most successful Allied operations of the war. General Alexei Brusilov used innovative tactics involving surprise attacks, coordinated assaults, and flexible formations. His forces broke through Austro-Hungarian defenses, capturing vast territory and inflicting enormous casualties. The offensive nearly shattered Austria-Hungary's army and forced Germany to divert reinforcements from the Western Front. But Russia's victories came at a high cost. The strain of constant warfare, food shortages, economic disruption, and political dissatisfaction weakened the Russian state. The enormous casualties suffered in earlier defeats, such as Tannenberg and the Carpathian campaigns, had already eroded faith in the government. Now, even as Brusilov achieved success, Russia's internal divisions deepened. Soldiers grew weary, civilians restless, and opposition movements more vocal. The pressures building within Russia would eventually erupt into revolution. In the Balkans and the Middle East, the war continued to spread. Serbia, forced into exile, reorganized on the island of Corfu and later joined Allied operations in Salonika. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire fought against British and Commonwealth forces in campaigns stretching from Mesopotamia to the Sinai. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915, meant to force open the Dardanelles, had ended in failure for the Allies, but new battles soon emerged as both sides contested vital territory and supply routes. One of the most dramatic developments in the Middle East came with the Arab Revolt, launched in June 1916. Encouraged by British promises of support for Arab independence, Sharif Hussein of Mecca led a rebellion against Ottoman rule. The revolt gained momentum with the assistance of British officers such as T.E. Lawrence, whose knowledge of the region and guerrilla tactics helped energize Arab fighters. The revolt weakened Ottoman control and tied down valuable forces in a region already strained by multiple fronts. As the war widened geographically, its impact on global society deepened. Industrial production soared as factories switched from civilian goods to weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Governments introduced conscription, rationing, and strict control over the economy. Women continued to enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles previously dominated by men, from factory labor to transportation, nursing, and administrative work. Their contributions proved essential to sustaining the war effort, and would later influence movements for political rights and social reform. In Germany, Britain's naval blockade began to take a severe toll. Cut off from overseas trade, Germany faced shortages of food, fuel, and raw materials. Civilians endured the hunger winter of 1916 and 1917, marked by widespread malnutrition and hardship. German leaders responded with intensified submarine warfare, hoping to break Britain's supply lines and force a negotiated peace. But unrestricted submarine warfare would eventually draw the United States closer to intervention, setting the stage for a major turning point in the war. Austria-Hungary, already weakened by defeats, struggled to maintain unity among its diverse populations. National tensions grew as shortages, casualties, and political frustrations eroded loyalty to the empire. Ottoman forces faced similar challenges, dealing with internal dissent as well as external enemies. Even Britain and France, though more stable, grappled with the immense demands of a war that showed no sign of ending. By the end of 1916, it was clear that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand had unleashed a conflict of unprecedented scale and complexity. The war was no longer a matter of diplomatic disputes or regional ambitions. It had become a global catastrophe reshaping nations, societies, and the very foundations of the international order. Every month that passed drew the world deeper into suffering and upheaval. In the next part of the documentary, we will explore the pivotal events of 1917, a year that brought revolution, new alliances, and shifts in military power that ultimately shaped the path toward the war's final years. It was during this period that the long-range consequences of the assassination became fully visible, transforming not only Europe but the entire world. The year 1917 marked a profound turning point in the First World War. What began as a conflict triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had, by this stage, grown into a vast struggle consuming nations, transforming societies, and shaking the foundations of empires. 1917 would be remembered as a year of upheaval, revolution, and dramatic shifts in power, changes that would bring the world closer to the war's end, though at an unimaginable cost. One of the most significant developments of the year occurred in Russia. For years, the Russian Empire had struggled under the weight of military defeats, economic collapse, food shortages, and deep political dissatisfaction. The pressures of the war exacerbated already existing tensions. Millions of Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded, and many more lacked proper equipment or supplies. Civilians suffered severe shortages as inflation soared and transportation networks broke down. Discontent spread through factories, villages, and the army itself. In February 1917, this discontent erupted into open revolution. Protests in Petrograd, fueled by hunger and frustration, grew rapidly. Workers went on strike, soldiers refused to fire on crowds, and demonstrations turned into a nationwide uprising. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II faced the collapse of his authority. With no support remaining among military commanders or political elites, he abdicated the throne, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The fall of the Tsar shocked the world and reshaped the course of the war. A provisional government took power, pledging to continue fighting alongside the Allies. But Russia's problems ran deeper than political change alone. Soldiers were exhausted and increasingly unwilling to participate in a war they no longer believed in. Peasants demanded land reform. Workers demanded better conditions. Radical movements gained strength, especially the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, who returned to Russia from exile with German assistance. Germany hoped that Lenin's presence would destabilize Russia further, allowing Germany to shift more troops to the Western Front. Throughout 1917, the provisional government struggled to maintain control. Its decision to continue the war proved deeply unpopular. In July, a failed military offensive further weakened its authority. By autumn, the Bolsheviks saw an opportunity. On November 7, they seized power in Petrograd, overthrowing the provisional government in what became known as the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread, slogans that resonated with a population desperate for relief. One of the new government's first actions was to seek an armistice with Germany. Peace negotiations began at Brest-Litovsk in December 1917. Though formal terms would not be finalized until 1918, Russia's withdrawal from the war dramatically altered the strategic balance. Germany could now shift large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front to the West, hoping for a final decisive offensive before American forces arrived in significant numbers. The United States, meanwhile, was moving steadily toward intervention. Since the war's beginning, America had maintained a stance of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson believed the United States should remain a mediator rather than a participant in Europe's conflict. But neutrality grew increasingly difficult as the war dragged on and as German actions tested American patience. The turning point came with Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917. German U-boats targeted ships supplying Britain, including vessels carrying American goods. German leaders believed they could starve Britain into surrender before the United States could mobilize effectively. But their strategy backfired. When German submarines sank American ships and American sailors were killed, public opinion shifted sharply in favor of entering the war. The final spark came with the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico proposing an alliance if the United States entered the war. The telegram promised Mexico the recovery of territories lost to the United States decades earlier. When the British shared the telegram with Washington and its contents were made public, American outrage surged. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Though American troops would take time to train and deploy, the psychological impact was immediate. For the first time, the Allies possessed access to seemingly unlimited industrial and manpower resources. Germany recognized that the entry of the United States threatened its ability to sustain the war. Elsewhere on the Western Front, 1917 was marked by continued stalemates and massive offensives. In April, the French army launched the Nivelle offensive, promising a breakthrough that would end the war within days. But the assault failed disastrously. French soldiers, already exhausted and demoralized, suffered heavy casualties for little gain. The failure sparked widespread mutinies across the French army. Soldiers refused to participate in futile attacks but remained willing to defend their positions. French leadership responded with reforms and improved rest conditions, slowly restoring discipline. The mutinies revealed the growing cracks in the armies of nations stretched beyond their limits. Britain, meanwhile, launched the Passchendaele offensive in Flanders, aiming to break through German lines and capture strategic ridges near Ypres. Heavy rains turned the battlefield into a swamp of mud so deep that men, horses, and equipment became trapped. The horrific conditions slowed progress to a crawl. Passchendaele became another symbol of the war's senseless brutality. Hundreds of thousands were killed or wounded, and the ground gained was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Beyond Europe, the war continued to expand. In the Middle East, British and Arab forces made significant gains against the Ottomans. General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem in December 1917, a major symbolic victory. In Mesopotamia, British forces took Baghdad earlier that year. The Arab revolt gained momentum as tribal leaders joined the fight against Ottoman rule, encouraged by British support and their own aspirations for independence. Across the world, societies grappled with the strain of a war that seemed endless. Food shortages grew worse. Governments imposed censorship and propaganda campaigns more aggressively. Workers went on strike. Civilians endured bombardments, rationing, and constant anxiety. The war influenced every aspect of daily life, shaping attitudes, expectations, and hopes for the future. Yet even as nations struggled, new ideas and political movements gained strength. Socialism, nationalism, and demands for democratic reform flourished in wartime conditions. Women, having taken on expanded roles in industry and public life, pushed for political rights with renewed energy. Colonial subjects questioned imperial rule as they watched European nations tear themselves apart. By the end of 1917, the world was dramatically different from the one that had existed when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated 3 years earlier. Empires tottered on the brink of collapse. Armies were stretched thin. Populations were exhausted. And yet the war continued, driven forward by the hope that victory, however defined, might still be possible. In the next part of the documentary, we will explore the decisive final year of the conflict, 1918. It was during this year that Germany launched its last, desperate offensives, that the Allies regained momentum, and that the forces unleashed by the assassination in Sarajevo finally brought the old world order crashing down. The year 1918 marked the final and most decisive phase of the First World War, the culmination of all the forces that had been unleashed since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. By this point, the conflict had consumed empires, taken millions of lives, and reshaped the world in ways no one could have imagined in June 1914. And yet, the outcome remained uncertain. Germany believed that with Russia out of the war and before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers, it had a final opportunity to achieve victory. The Allies, weary but strengthened by new resources and leadership, prepared to withstand whatever came next. 1918 would become a year of desperate offensives, dramatic reversals, and the ultimate collapse of the old European order. Germany's last great bid for victory began in the spring. With Russia's exit from the war formalized by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, Germany was able to transfer hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. German commanders knew that American troops were arriving in ever-increasing numbers, but they believed that if they struck decisively before American strength became overwhelming, they could force the Allies to the negotiating table. The German High Command, now dominated by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, planned a series of massive offensives designed to break the stalemate. These attacks, collectively known as the Spring Offensive or the Kaiserschlacht, began on March 21. The initial assault, Operation Michael, targeted the British front near St. Quentin. Using new stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving units trained to infiltrate weaknesses in the enemy line, Germany achieved impressive breakthroughs. British and French forces fell back under the pressure. Paris braced for the possibility of another German advance toward the capital. For a moment, it seemed Germany might succeed. The offensive drove deep into Allied territory, causing widespread alarm. But the very success of the German advance created new problems. Supply lines became overstretched. Stormtrooper units, the elite spearhead of the offensive, suffered irreplaceable losses. The German army lacked the reserves needed to exploit its gains fully. As the offensive slowed, Allied reinforcements, including American units, filled the gaps. Germany launched a second and third offensive in April and May, again achieving gains but failing to break the Allied line completely. The attacks inflicted heavy casualties but exhausted German strength. Each new push grew weaker. German soldiers were fighting under dire conditions, poor nutrition, low morale, and growing unrest on the home front. The British, French, and now American forces held firm. On July 15, Germany launched its final major offensive, the Second Battle of the Marne. This time, the Allies were prepared. They absorbed the German assault and then counterattacked decisively. The tide of the war turned. German forces, worn down by months of fighting, began to retreat. Ludendorff realized that the war could no longer be won. The Allied counteroffensive that followed, known as the 100 Days Offensive, pushed the Germans back relentlessly. Under the unified command of French General Ferdinand Foch, British, French, Canadian, Australian, and American forces attacked along multiple points of the line. The momentum shifted completely. Village by village, mile by mile, the Allies reclaimed territory lost earlier in the year. American involvement grew crucial during this time. By the summer of 1918, over 1 million American soldiers had arrived in Europe, with many more on the way. Fresh, well-supplied, and motivated, the Americans brought new energy to the Allied forces. Battles such as Belleau would demonstrated their resolve. The arrival of American troops also boosted Allied morale and signaled to Germany that time was running out. On the home front, Germany was disintegrating. The naval blockade imposed by Britain had caused severe shortages of food and fuel. Civilians faced hunger and unrest. Strikes spread across factories. Political support for the war collapsed. Soldiers at the front wrote letters describing impossible conditions, dwindling supplies, and a sense that they were fighting for a lost cause. Austria-Hungary, Germany's most important ally, also began to crumble. The empire's diverse populations demanded independence. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Croats, and others saw the weakening of Vienna as an opportunity to pursue national self-determination. The empire could no longer sustain its armies or control its territories. In October, Austria-Hungary began negotiating for peace. The Ottoman Empire, too, neared collapse. After heavy defeats in the Middle East, including the loss of Damascus and Aleppo, the Ottomans sought an armistice toward the end of the year. Bulgaria, exhausted and threatened by advancing Allied forces, signed an armistice in September, removing itself from the war entirely. Germany now stood alone. Ludendorff, overwhelmed by the crisis, suffered a breakdown. Kaiser Wilhelm was urged by his advisors to seek peace. By late October, German forces were in full retreat along the Western Front. The Allies continued their advance, pushing ever closer to Germany's borders. Revolution erupted within Germany. Sailors mutinied in Kiel. Workers and soldiers formed councils in major cities, inspired in part by events in Russia. The monarchy collapsed as revolution spread. On November 9, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A new German republic was proclaimed. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, representatives of the new German government met with Allied commanders in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. At 5 o'clock in the morning, they signed the armistice. Fighting would stop at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. After 4 years of unprecedented destruction, the guns finally fell silent. Across Europe, soldiers looked up from trenches, stunned by the sudden quiet. Civilians poured into the streets, celebrating and mourning at the same time. Millions had died. Entire empires had fallen. The map of Europe would soon be redrawn. And at the root of it all lay the assassination of a single man in Sarajevo, an act that had seemed local and limited at the time but that had triggered a chain reaction powerful enough to reshape the world. In the next part of the documentary, we will explore the consequences and aftermath of the war, the collapse of empires, the Treaty of Versailles, the birth of new nations, and the profound ways in which the assassination of Franz Ferdinand set the stage not only for the First World War but for the turbulent decades that followed. When the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world stood at the threshold of a new and uncertain era. The First World War, begun over 4 years earlier with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had destroyed empires, redrawn borders, and altered the lives of millions. But the end of fighting did not immediately bring stability. Instead, the aftermath revealed deep wounds, political, economic, and emotional, that would shape the course of the 20th century and lay the groundwork for future upheavals. One of the most immediate and dramatic consequences of the war was the collapse of 4 major empires: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. Each had dominated vast territories and diverse populations before the war. By 1918, all were shattered beyond repair. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose internal tensions had played a critical role in the origins of the war, disintegrated completely. National groups across the empire declared independence as the central government in Vienna lost control. Czechoslovakia emerged as a new nation composed of Czechs and Slovaks. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later known as Yugoslavia, united several South Slavic peoples under one country. Hungary separated from Austria, and the two became independent states for the first time in centuries. Poland regained independence after long periods of partition. What remained of Austria-Hungary was a fraction of its former size, a landlocked remnant of an empire that had once stretched across Central Europe. Germany, too, underwent dramatic transformation. Military defeat and internal revolution brought an end to the monarchy. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II paved the way for the creation of the Weimar Republic, a fragile democratic government that faced enormous challenges from the outset. Germany was ravaged by hunger, economic turmoil, and political extremism. Many Germans believed they had been betrayed or humiliated, a sentiment that would later have dangerous consequences. The Ottoman Empire collapsed as well, leaving behind a complex mosaic of territories in the Middle East, the Balkans, and Anatolia. British and French mandates took control of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Palestine. Arab leaders, who had hoped for independence, found themselves under new forms of foreign rule. In Anatolia, a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk resisted the division of Turkish lands, eventually establishing the Republic of Turkey in 1923. Russia had already undergone its own transformation during the war, with the fall of the Romanov dynasty and the rise of the Bolsheviks. The Russian Civil War continued even after the armistice, with red and white forces battling for control of the vast country. The eventual victory of the Bolsheviks laid the foundation for the Soviet Union, a powerful new state whose ideology and ambitions would shape global politics for decades. Amid this upheaval, the victorious Allies convened in Paris in 1919 to determine the terms of peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of that year, was the most significant of the treaties that emerged from the conference. It imposed heavy territorial losses, military restrictions, and financial reparations on Germany. The treaty's authors aimed to prevent Germany from ever threatening Europe again, but the severity of the terms sowed resentment among Germans and weakened the new Weimar government. Versailles also embodied the principle of national self-determination, promoted by American President Woodrow Wilson. This principle guided the creation of new states and the redrawing of borders throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Yet it could not be applied consistently. Some ethnic groups found themselves in new countries where they were minorities. Others were divided among several states. The attempt to create stability through these borders instead laid the foundation for future disputes and conflicts. Alongside the Treaty of Versailles, other agreements reshaped territories once ruled by the defeated powers. The Treaty of Saint-Germain formalized the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. The Treaty of Trianon confirmed Hungary's new borders. The Treaty of Sèvres sought to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, though it was later replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne. Each agreement reflected the ambitions and fears of the victorious powers, as well as the complex realities of a world undergoing rapid change. But the political consequences were only part of the story. The human cost of the war was staggering. More than 10 million soldiers had been killed. Millions more were wounded, many with injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Civilian casualties were immense, caused not only by military action but by famine, disease, and hardship. The Spanish flu pandemic, which spread rapidly in the war's final months, killed tens of millions worldwide, compounding the grief and devastation. Entire generations had been scarred by the experience of war. Veterans returned home physically and psychologically wounded. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. In Britain, France, Germany, and Austria, towns and villages held collective memory of loss. War memorials rose in city squares, bearing long lists of names. Families mourned sons, fathers, brothers, and husbands who would never return. Societies had been transformed by the shared trauma of industrialized warfare. Economically, Europe faced ruin. Infrastructure lay in ruins across wide areas. Factories and farms were destroyed or abandoned. Inflation surged. Unemployment rose. Governments struggled to rebuild their economies while also caring for disabled veterans and grieving families. The enormous debts accumulated during the war strained national budgets and international markets. Amid all this suffering, new ideas and movements emerged. In many countries, workers demanded better conditions, political rights, and social reform. Women, who had played crucial roles in wartime industries, continued to push for suffrage and greater equality. Anti-colonial movements gained strength as people in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East questioned the legitimacy of imperial rule. The world order was shifting, shaped by forces that had been unleashed long before the war had even begun. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand had triggered a chain reaction, but the deep causes of the war lay in decades of competition, nationalism, and unresolved tensions. The conflict revealed the fragility of the old European system. The empires that had dominated the 19th century could not withstand the pressures of modern industrialized war. The treaties that followed tried to create a new order but often struggled to address the complexities of diverse populations and historic grievances. In the end, the war's legacy was profoundly mixed. It ended some forms of oppression while giving rise to new ones. It brought independence to some nations while creating mandates and colonial arrangements for others. It inspired hope for lasting peace through the League of Nations but left unresolved bitterness in defeated countries. And the political, economic, and social strains left by the war would, within 2 decades, contribute to the rise of new ideologies and new conflicts. In the next and final part of the documentary, we will reflect on the broader meaning of the assassination that began it all. We will look back to Sarajevo and consider how the death of a single archduke set in motion forces far beyond what any of the conspirators, or the leaders of the great powers, could have imagined. The legacy of that moment continues to shape our understanding of history and the world we live in today. As we return to Sarajevo in our minds, to that single moment on June 28, 1914, when Gavrilo Princip stepped forward with a pistol and fired the shots that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, we are struck by the immense contrast between the simplicity of the act and the vast complexity of the world it altered. The assassination itself lasted only seconds. The reverberations of those shots would echo for decades. To understand the full significance of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, we must consider not only what happened, but why it mattered so profoundly. The Archduke's death was not, by itself, enough to cause a world war. Assassinations had occurred before without triggering global catastrophe. But in the summer of 1914, Europe was a continent poised on the edge of conflict. Old grievances, national ambitions, imperial rivalries, military plans, and political fears had created a system so rigid and so fragile that a single spark could ignite it. Princip's shots were that spark. The assassination mattered in part because Franz Ferdinand was not an ordinary political figure. As heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, he represented the future of an empire already strained by internal divisions. His death was perceived by Vienna not only as an attack on the imperial family but as a direct challenge to the authority and stability of the empire itself. Austria-Hungary responded with a harshness born of fear and frustration, seeking to assert control in a region where its influence was rapidly eroding. But the assassination also mattered because of the alliances that had formed in Europe. Austria-Hungary turned to Germany, which offered unconditional support. Serbia turned to Russia, which saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples. Germany looked toward France, knowing that Russia's mobilization would draw France into the conflict. France relied on Britain, and Britain feared a Europe dominated by German power. These alliances, built over years of suspicion and competition, meant that any conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia risked pulling in the entire continent. The war that followed was not one that any single leader sought deliberately. It was the result of decisions made under pressure, often based on miscalculations, miscommunications, and flawed assumptions. Leaders hoped that shows of force would intimidate rivals into backing down. Instead, each step hardened positions and narrowed choices. Mobilization schedules, military doctrines, and political fears overwhelmed diplomacy. When the war began, it did so not because one nation willed it, but because none of the great powers could find a safe or honorable way to reverse course. The consequences of the war were beyond imagining. More than 10 million soldiers died. Millions more were wounded. Civilian casualties, caused by starvation, disease, and devastation, added to the toll. Empires that had existed for centuries crumbled. Borders were redrawn. Entire societies were traumatized. The political landscape of Europe was transformed, setting the stage for revolutions, new ideologies, and eventually another world war. And yet, it is important to remember that the assassination itself was carried out not by a government, nor by a general, but by young men who believed they were fighting for national liberation. Gavrilo Princip and his companions were shaped by the tensions of their time, by nationalist dreams, by resentment toward imperial rule, by the belief that violence could change the course of history. They did not foresee the global destruction that would follow. They saw their actions as part of a regional struggle, not realizing that the world had become too interconnected, too brittle, and too anxious for such an act to remain contained. In the years that followed the war, historians and statesmen sought to assign blame. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Germany blamed Russia. the Allies blamed Germany. Others blamed the system of alliances, the arms race, or the stubbornness of leaders. But deeper reflection reveals that responsibility for the war was shared across nations and institutions. The assassination was the trigger, but the causes were far older and more complex. Franz Ferdinand himself remains a figure of tragic irony. He had advocated for reforms within the empire that might have eased tensions among its many ethnic groups. He opposed war with Serbia and was skeptical of military adventures. Had he lived to rule, he might have pursued policies that delayed or even prevented the empire's collapse. But history did not grant him that chance. Instead, his death became the catalyst for the destruction of the very empire he hoped to modernize. As we look back at the road from Sarajevo to the armistice of 1918, we see not only a story of conflict but a story of unintended consequences. The war reshaped the world, new nations emerged, old systems fell, and the seeds of future conflicts were planted. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure peace, instead created resentment that would contribute to the rise of extremism in Germany. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire redrew the Middle East in ways that still influence global politics today. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia would lead to the formation of the Soviet Union and shape international relations for most of the 20th century. And yet, amid these vast transformations, the memory of Sarajevo remains central. It reminds us of the fragility of peace, the dangers of rigid alliances, and the unpredictable consequences of political violence. It teaches us that history is shaped not only by the decisions of great powers, but by the actions of individuals who live within larger systems they cannot fully understand. When Franz Ferdinand and Sophie climbed into their car that morning in Sarajevo, they could not have known that they were stepping into a moment that would change the world. When Princip pulled the trigger, he could not have imagined that he was setting in motion events that would transform nations, topple empires, and define a century. The assassination was brief, but its impact was vast and enduring. Today, the story of the assassination and the war it helped unleash remains a powerful reminder of the responsibility borne by nations and leaders. It underscores the importance of diplomacy, restraint, and understanding in a world where decisions made in moments of crisis can echo across generations. And it reminds us that history is never inevitable. It is shaped by choices made by governments, by leaders, and sometimes by individuals whose actions reach far beyond what they intend. Thus, we conclude our journey from the streets of Sarajevo to the collapse of empires and the creation of a new world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the beginning of a story that reshaped humanity. It is a story of tragedy, complexity, and consequence, one that continues to inform our understanding of war, peace, and the fragile threads that connect them.